Rukpli Onslaught by Matt Edsan. Narrated by Matt Edsan. Chapter 1 Armstrong Station, Euphra Orbit. Captain Stanley walked quickly towards the mess hall. Korea was beside him. He only hoped the teams had gotten everything together. The sudden appearance of the Rukpli vessels around Armstrong Station had put everyone on the defensive. All the preparation that had been made or lack thereof would now be put to the test. The decision by the Rukpli to target the space station hadn't come as a surprise, to him at least. Although Commander Diaz wouldn't admit it, she had been rattled. The tension on her face had been so evident. SciTech and Korea had taken the whole situation in stride, which was expected. The moment Stanley stepped into the mess hall, he noticed the teams scattered around the place. Had everyone been briefed? Stanley asked. Each team was led by a UFS officer. He had let Diaz assign her staff as leads for each team. Initially, Diaz had been hesitant about letting her officers take charge. She must have been worried ever since the attack by Lieutenant Mills and his group. However, Stanley had been able to convince her otherwise. Diaz's officers were the ideal ones to be in charge of each team for no other reason than the fact that they knew the station better than anyone else. Each team also consisted of 2 Rabinto and 2 to 3 more humans. It was a daring plan, but Stanley felt it would work. All the members of each team had a rifle blaster while the humans were wearing the Trebium armor. Korea had shared with him how she had been able to detect the explosives seconds before it had detonated. The Rabinto species had enhanced hearing abilities. Stanley had been impressed to discover it. That alone had saved his life. Based on Korea's sharing, Stanley had requested each team include 2 Rabinto. Initially, he had been concerned that the Rabinto might not want to help out. However, those fears had been dispelled once Korea updated him on the numbers. Many more Rabinto had volunteered to defend the space station. It was a reassuring sign that the Rabinto wanted to work with humanity. The Rabinto would not only be the ears for the team, but would serve as the frontline attack force for each team. Stanley had been concerned that Korea and SciTech in particular might disagree with using their kind as the front line. Surprisingly, they agreed. The reason was obvious. The Rukpli couldn't body jump into the Rabinto. The 2 Rabinto would serve as a barrier for each team. The Trebium armor on the humans would provide one level of protection, but it was limited. Despite all their planning, Stanley didn't know if the Rukpli had others who could penetrate the Trebium armor. Yes, sir, all the team lead officers shouted in unison. The Rabinto in each team nodded. Stanley presumed Korea's presence there made them more obedient to what was ahead for everyone. Korea seemed to command a lot of respect from all the Rabinto he had encountered. We must assume the Rukpli know that the Rabinto are on board, Stanley admitted. Whatever happens, we must defend this station. It and the other vessels are the only defense against a full assault by the Rukpli on Euphra. After the Rukpli vessels had revealed themselves around Armstrong Station, they still hadn't made any moves. Diaz and her team at the Operations Center were keeping a close eye on the vessels. The Rukpli vessels out there must have already completed a scan of the space station. Knowing the Rukpli's strategic prowess, Stanley knew the Rukpli would be ready for the Rabinto. Stanley opened the private comms to Diaz. Start the jamming now. He hoped the jamming would prevent the Rukpli's sensors from determining the locations of the teams throughout the space station. Get to your respective locations and be ready, Stanley ordered. Once you are in place, I need every lead to check in with me. Stanley and Korea stepped aside as the multiple teams began moving out of the mess hall. Once the mess hall had been emptied, Korea turned to him. Do you think the jamming will work? Stanley shrugged. I don't know. But we need to give each team a chance to protect their assigned area. But this station is huge, Korea interjected. We don't have enough people to cover every part of it. Stanley nodded reluctantly. There was no way to cover every section of the space station. The multiple teams had been deployed to critical locations based on Diaz's recommendations. That would have to do, at least for now. Stanley had instructed the teams to be ready to improvise on the fly. They couldn't make any assumptions with the Rukpli. Diaz's shaky voice crackled through the comms. Captain, you need to come to the Operations Center now. Chapter 2 Operations Center, Armstrong Station. What's going on? Stanley asked as he stepped into the Operations Center with Korea beside him. Diaz pointed at the screen. See for yourselves. Stanley narrowed his eyes. 2 of the Rukpli vessels directly in front of them had opened their launch tubes, and a sea of drones were emerging out of them. How long has this been going on for? Stanley asked. A few minutes, Diaz replied. I called you the moment the first vessel opened its launch tubes. It was the first time a Rukpli vessel had opened its launch tubes. Stanley hadn't even known that the Rukpli vessel had launch tubes. Not until just now. The hull of the Rukpli vessel did not reveal anything. Stanley found it unnerving that there was so much they didn't know about the Rukpli aliens. "We are tracking the drone's movements," Diaz added. "For now, they are simply gathering at a position in front of their respective vessels." Stanley doubted the drones would remain in that position for too long. The Rukpli already had a plan when those launch tubes were opened. "What are they waiting for?" Corey asked. "I don't know," Diaz replied. "Our shields are up. The shields should be able to neutralize any impending attack by the drones." Diaz was putting a lot of faith in a space station's shields. Apparently, they had been upgraded recently prior to his return from the fringe of the one-year system. However, Stanley was skeptical. Since they didn't know how much firepower the Rukpli actually had, they couldn't take anything for granted. "Has the boarding been completed?" Stanley asked. Diaz nodded. "Sitek and the rest of the Rubinto are on the UFS Intrepid. Mendez said they are ready at your command to leave the space station. The undocking process has already been completed." Stanley had ordered the rest of the Rubinto to board his vessel so that Mendez could take them away from the space station once the attack began. Initially, Sitek had been resistant to the plan. He wanted more of the Rubinto to stay and fight alongside the humans. Stanley had found his courage impressive, but he had told Correa of his concerns of keeping too many Rubinto on Armstrong Station. Thankfully, Correa had been instrumental in convincing Sitek of the reality and had spared Stanley of the challenge of confronting the Rubinto leader. While some Rubinto had been assigned to the teams, Stanley felt too many Rubinto on the space station would become a hindrance to focusing on the Rukpli. The Rubinto species' chances of survival were greater if the UFS Intrepid took them away from the space station. He had been surprised by Correa's decision to volunteer and stay on board the space station with the teams. Stanley had expected her to join Sitek and protect her species, and yet Sitek hadn't said a word against her decision. It was yet another thing that puzzled Stanley. Stanley had also informed Sheldon of his plans, and the Admiral had given his approval to proceed. Stanley suspected the Admiral was too preoccupied preparing the cities for the ground invasion. Stanley continued to keep his gaze on the drones hovering outside the space station. More of them were streaming out of the two vessels and joining the rest. Then it dawned on him what the Rukpli were doing. "I know why they are waiting," Stanley announced. "We need to fire on those drones now." Chapter 3, Bridge UFS Intrepid. Commander Mendez looked at the view screen. The order had come from Captain Stanley. They were to leave once the space station's point defense cannons began firing at the drones. Mendez had been nervous as he had watched the drones amass at one end of the space station. There were so many of them, and they kept coming out of the Rukpli vessels. What was the Rukpli up to with the drones? It was anyone's guess. With the arrival of the Rukpli ships, he had wanted the captain to return to the vessel, but as he had expected, Stanley had refused to do so. Mendez knew he didn't have the authority to force his captain back. Stanley was always stubborn. Even after the incident at the fringe of the one-year system, he hadn't seemed to have learned his lesson. Despite that, Mendez understood the captain's reasons. The defense of the space station was of great importance. Mendez had been given the responsibility to ferry away the rest of the Rubinto species. He hadn't warmed up to the idea, but had followed his captain's orders. He could only hope that Stanley knew what he was doing. Although Stanley was still a young captain, Mendez admired him for his grit and determination in facing the Rukpli. He and his crew found sufficient space for Sitek and the rest of the Rubinto on board the UFS Intrepid. To make space and support the defense of the space station, a contingent of his officers had also boarded Armstrong Station. "Report on the Rukpli vessels," Mendez asked. "No movement by the vessels," the sensor officer reported. "Be ready to move on my mark," Mendez ordered. "Affirmative," the navigation officer replied. Mendez had ordered his crew to plot a route away from the space station. Fortunately, there was a gap in between two Rukpli vessels that would provide safe passage. That was assuming the Rukpli vessels didn't fire upon them. Even if they did, Mendez felt confident that the UFS Intrepid could make it through without any significant damage or hull breaches. "Commander, it has started," the sensor officer announced. Streaks of red lights lit up the darkness of space around the space station. The point defense cannons were relentless in their fire. Explosions began to consume the drones. The drones began to fire back. Red and blue streaks of fire danced against each other. Mendez noticed that none of the blue streaks from the drones appeared to make any headway against the space station's shields. "Now," Mendez ordered. He felt the UFS Intrepid lurch forward as it left the space station. Mendez sighed, not knowing if he would be able to return to the space station anytime soon. Stanley had been firm in his decision despite Mendez's objections. He was to meet up with the other vessels on the other side of Euphra and prepare to defend the planet. Stanley was expecting more Rukpli vessels to appear. Mendes agreed with him. There was no need to concentrate all their vessels around the space station. It was even possible that the Rukpli strategy counted on them converging and defending the space station, thereby exposing the rest of the planet. We are clear of the vessels, the navigation officer said. They didn't even power up their weapons. Mendes suppressed a sigh of relief. He hadn't expected it to be that easy. At a minimum, he had expected the two nearest Rukpli vessels to attack them, but they hadn't, which was strange. Why had the Rukpli vessel let them get away? There had to be a reason. They would have seen them moving. It didn't seem to make sense. But Mendes had no time to ponder on that. He knew his immediate objective and intended to get it done. Keep us moving quickly, Mendes said. Let the UFS Winston know we are on the way to their position. Aye, sir, navigation officer said. Captain Stanley and Commander Diaz were on their own. Mendes hoped they would be able to defend the space station. Without proper Trebium armor around the space station, it was not going to be easy to hold the Rukpli aliens back. Chapter 4, Operation Center, Armstrong Station. What's the status of our shields? Diaz asked. Our shields are holding, Lieutenant Sherry replied. Diaz continued to stare out the view screen. The Rukpli drones were just firing indiscriminately. The point defense cannons were doing their job. Drones were being destroyed, but for every row of drones that disintegrated, another row took its place. Diaz sighed. She had been nervous following Stanley's instructions, but the captain had been able to convince her. They seemed to have an endless supply of drones, Sherry admitted. Her lieutenant was nervous, and she had every right to be. Other than the two Rukpli vessels that were unloading their drones, none of the other ships had moved to counter the point defense cannons. Diaz found it disturbing. Why weren't the Rukpli vessels reacting? What were they doing? Maybe they had caught the Rukpli by surprise. Even then, Diaz would have expected a reaction, at least by now. The UFS Intrepid has cleared the Rukpli vessels, Sherry announced. It's like the Rukpli just let them go. Before leaving the operations center, Stanley had shared that the Rukpli vessels were possibly waiting for others to arrive. It did make sense. The Rukpli vessels surrounding the space station were trying to isolate them from whatever was coming later. Firing the point defense cannons had been to elicit a response from the Rukpli, and the drones had fired back. But the Rukpli vessel hadn't. It was as if the Rukpli preferred to let their drones do all the engagement. But to what end? Cease firing, Diaz ordered. But Captain Stanley said. Sherry's voice trailed off. I know what he said, but just do it, Diaz insisted. The point defense cannon stopped firing, and immediately the drones also ceased returning fire. But that wasn't the only thing that stopped. The sea of drones emerging from the Rukpli vessels also came to a halt. Sherry turned to her. Why did they stop? Diaz shook her head. Then Stanley's voice crackled through her private comms. Commander, why have we stopped firing? Diaz frowned. She had hoped Stanley wouldn't pick up on the cessation of the weapons fire so soon. It was no use, Diaz said. We were wasting our resources. She could sense Sherry's eyes on her. Diaz glared at her and Sherry turned back to her console. Have the drones moved, Stanley asked. Negative, Diaz replied. For every drone that we destroy, another appears. And the Rukpli vessels haven't done anything yet. It's like they're ignoring us. Something isn't right here. Okay, Stanley conceded. I'll let you decide. With that, the comms went dead. Diaz knew Stanley wasn't happy with her decision. She sensed it in his tone, and he was frustrated. They all were. Being surrounded by the Rukpli vessels was beginning to affect everyone on the space station. No one liked the vessels just floating out there. It was nerve-wracking. Commander, the drones are moving, Sherry announced. Diaz turned her gaze back to the view screen. A small group of drones had broken formation and were heading towards one of the corners of the space station. Chapter 5, Southern Perimeter, Arcadia. Marine Captain Peters peered across the area just outside the southern perimeter of the city. He anticipated this would be as good a point as any for the Rukpli vessels to attack from. The primary reason was the terrain itself. The landscape in front of him was flat and suitable for landing vessels. The other sides of the city were more mountainous and would make troop deployment and advancement more complicated. Ever since he had received the alert that Rukpli vessels had surrounded Armstrong Station, he had been forced to push aside his thoughts about his father and the loss of the UFS Trident. Prior to that, he had kept to himself as he had struggled with everything that had happened. During the last few nights, he had been at war with his own thoughts and guilt, and he hadn't gotten much sleep. Every morning he would wake up tired as if he had wrestled with someone all night long. At certain times of the day, Peters found himself thinking of his father. It was a strange experience. Such things had never happened before to him, and yet he found memories of his father resurfacing at the most unexpected of times. Some of those memories were joyful, but most weren't. Despite all this, Peters refused to talk about it with anyone. He knew there were medical personnel who could help him, but he didn't want their advice. Now wasn't the right time. He had to defeat the Rukpli. If not, his father's loss would be for nothing. If there was one thing Peters was sure about, was that his father would want him to move on and do his duty. Serving had always been the highest honor for his father. Nothing else came even a close second place. Fortunately, no one, including Lieutenant Cruz, had brought up the matter of the loss of his father. However, Peters wasn't a fool. He could sense the eyes of those in his unit on him whenever he walked around them. He could imagine they were talking about his father behind his back. It was impossible for the loss of Earth's greatest general not to be the talk of everyone around him. Despite that, Peters didn't have time to sort out all his feelings on the matter. He didn't want to face the stark truth, not now. The alert on the arrival of the Rukpli had been exactly the sort of distraction he needed. And, ironically, it had come at the most opportune time, at least for him. If they survived the Rukpli attack, then he could take some time out and think about everything. Cruz's voice broke through his thoughts. Captain, the trenches are nearly complete. It had been Cruz's idea to dig trenches around parts of the southern perimeter of Arcadia. Peters had agreed with her. The strategy was a throwback to Earth's historical wars. When he was young, his father had often told him stories about wars on Earth. In those days, the stories had excited him, and Peters had often dreamt about being right in the middle of them. Now, looking ahead to the Rukpli, he realized those were the dreams of foolish boys who didn't understand the cost of war. Once Peters had approved of Cruz's plan, it had been just a matter of getting the equipment over to get the work done. The crew and the soldiers had worked through the night. Do you really think the Rukpli will send down the troops? Cruz asked. Peters nodded. I have no doubt about it. It was not that he didn't have faith in Stanley's ability to defend the planet, but the Rukpli aliens could eventually send so many vessels that they would easily overwhelm the planet's orbital defenses. One space station and several vessels wouldn't be enough against a formidable Rukpli fleet. He didn't want to imagine what was happening up there on the space station. They could conduct an orbital bombardment and destroy the city Cruz proposed. That would be the most efficient way. They could, Peters mused, but I have a feeling the Rukpli will want to keep the city intact. If you are Rukpli, wouldn't you want to occupy a city without destroying it? I mean, you not only get rid of your enemy, but get their city and resources for free. That's how we think, Cruz reminded him. We don't know how the Rukpli aliens actually think about anything. Maybe they will want to kill us all and move on. He acknowledged Cruz. She did make a credible argument. No one knew how the Rukpli thought about everything. And Peter suspected there was more behind the Rukpli's way of strategizing. Whoever was giving the orders was a master strategist. Privately, Peters feared that the Rukpli seemed to have access to information no one else would have. He hadn't brought this matter up to General Williams nor Admiral Sheldon. There hadn't been time for it with the loss of the USS Trident and the arrival of the Rukpli vessels in space. At this very moment, it was also no longer pertinent. Have the civilians moved to the bunkers? Peters asked. Some of the units are assisting the Euphra security services in ensuring all civilians have gone into the bunkers, Cruz replied. When Euphra had been initially colonized, the builders had insisted on creating large underground bunkers across Arcadia and other cities. At that time, the motivation had been that humanity was on its own out here, and they needed a way to protect themselves from the unknown in the Warrior system. Over the last 50 years, the bunkers had never been used, until now. We are fortunate to have the bunkers, Cruz added. If not, there would be nowhere to move the civilians. Peters agreed. Moving the civilians out of the cities would have been a Herculean task, and they didn't have the resources to do so while preparing the defenses around the city. The bunkers should be able to accommodate most of the population. Initially, he had expected there to be much resistance to the sudden emergency movement of civilians. However, after news had spread of the loss of the USS Trident, many people had just accepted the orders. Peters didn't know if that included the people in the settlement, but he didn't have the time to deal with them. The people in the settlements were on their own, and as his uncle had declared, they would need to put into action their words of defending their own settlements. What about the other cities? Peters asked. They are moving their civilians into the bunkers, Cruz replied, but I don't think the Rukpli will initially target them. Peters knew that the Rukpli wouldn't target the other cities until they had either captured or destroyed Arcadia. What about General Williams and Admiral Sheldon? Cruz asked. They've been asked to move to their designated bunkers, Peters replied. He expected both of them with the Euphra Council had moved into their designated bunkers by now. Sheldon and Williams would be kept at separate underground secret locations to ensure continuity of operations should the situation take a turn for the worse. What about the Rukpli prisoner? Peters asked. It's being moved according to your plan, Cruz replied. A smile curled around Peters' lips. Chapter 6, Operation Center, Armstrong Station. Target our firing on that group of drones, Diaz ordered. She now understood why the Rukpli vessel had been silent while the drones had emerged and returned fire once the point defense cannons had been activated. The Rukpli vessel had been scanning the space station for points of weakness. and it appeared that they must have identified a few points around Armstrong Station. She grimaced. As commander, she should have been able to pick up on it. What sector is that? Diaz asked. A4, Sherry replied. Scan for any structural weakness in that sector, Diaz said. She hoped her fears were unjustified and that the drones had simply chosen a random location on the space station to concentrate their fire upon. Sherry turned to her. Structural integrity is about 85%. We had some repairs done there during the last few months, but it wasn't completed after the initial attack on the Admiral. Diaz clenched her jaw. Her thinking had been right on point. The Rukpli had been scanning for weaknesses and they had found a glaring one. She could only hope the shields would hold up. Keep an eye on that sector, Diaz ordered. Affirmative. The point defense cannons were able to shoot down some of the drones that had broken formation, but more drones were moving in that same direction and at a faster speed. Commander, they have begun firing in that section of the station, Sherry announced. Diaz suppressed a sigh. It was only a matter of time before the drones got through the defenses. She just didn't know how much time they had. Armstrong Station had never been at the center of any attack until now. The drones keep coming, Sherry said nervously. If anything, the drones controlled by the Rukpli vessels were persistent. They wouldn't stop firing at that section of the space station until they achieved their objective. Commander, we have another problem, Sherry commented. Diaz followed her gaze and gasped. One of the Rukpli vessels had begun to move towards the space station. What was the Rukpli vessel doing? Then it dawned on her. The Rukpli vessel was heading towards that section of the space station. The Rukpli must have realized they would eventually run out of drones, so the next best thing was to ram the space station. The Rukpli were determined to break through the shield, but something kept nagging at her. Why hadn't the Rukpli decided to transport into the station? Everyone knew they had the ability to do that, and by now the Rukpli must have known that the space station had no Trebium armor protecting it. Then what kept the Rukpli from transporting over? There had to be a reason. However, Diaz couldn't put her finger on it. They're trying to ram us, Sherry shouted. Target that vessel now, Diaz ordered. It was the only thing she could do. There was no way to move the space station. It had to bear the brunt of the attack. Other point defense cannons began firing on the approaching Rukpli vessel. Rukpli vessel accelerating, Sherry said. Diaz sat down and buckled herself in as the Rukpli vessel rammed into that section of the space station. Chapter 7, Lower Decks, Armstrong Station. Stanley felt a shudder roll under his feet. He grabbed the railing on the side of the corridor. Coria did the same. What was that? Coria asked, as the shaking continued for a while longer than it should have. I don't know, Stanley replied. He had led Coria down here to check on the team guarding the engineering section of the space station. They had just finished checking in with the team and left engineering when the shudder had begun. Stanley had assigned Dalton to take charge of the team protecting engineering. It sounds like something, Stanley began. He was interrupted by another shudder. This one was more powerful than the previous one. Like? Coria asked. Stanley couldn't believe what had crossed his mind. Something ramming the station. The lights flickered on and off repeatedly along the corridor as another shudder rocked the space station. Then the corridor became dark before the auxiliary lights came on. Stanley opened the comms with Diaz. Commander, what happened? Diaz's voice was shaky. One of the Rukpli vessels rammed one section of the station. Initially, it didn't have much effect, but they kept ramming until the Rukpli vessel exploded, taking down our shields. Can you get the shields back up? Stanley asked. He couldn't believe the Rukpli aliens had sacrificed one of their own ships to breach the space station. With the shields down, the space station was completely vulnerable. Working on it now, Diaz reported, and the comms went silent. Coria's mouth hung open. She must have figured out the crux of the conversation. Why did they need to ram the station, Coria asked. They could have transported themselves over, right? Stanley had been wondering the same thing. It was obvious something about the Rukpli had changed, or something was keeping them from sending their troops over into the space station. There was no point speculating over what the Rukpli was doing. Stanley had learned that the Rukpli aliens had a different mode of thinking which seemed to defy human logic. They had to get ready for the arrival of the Rukpli onto Armstrong Station. He had hoped they could fend off the Rukpli for a while, but time had run out on them. Stanley opened the comms to all teams. Teams, be ready to engage with the Rukpli. Our shields are down. I repeat, our shields are down. Then a loud drilling sound began. It was coming from a deck below them. The floor started to shake. Stanley gestured to Coria, follow me. He led her to the end of the corridor and then they took the stairs to the bottommost deck. As he opened the door into the corridor, smoke came rushing out. Stanley coughed before covering his mouth. Coria seemed to be unaffected by the smoke. As Stanley turned to look into the corridor, his eyes widened at what he witnessed. There was a small hole on the floor at the center of the corridor. The smoke was coming out of it. Sparks were flying everywhere as more smoke engulfed the corridor. Something was drilling through into the space station. It had to be the Rukpli. Chapter 8, Lower Decks, Armstrong Station. Stanley pulled out his weapon and tightened his grip on it. Coria also had her weapon trained in front of her. Stanley tried to stop coughing as the dust continued to swirl along the corridor. There was no doubt of the drilling sound. "Dalton, bring half your team over here now," Stanley ordered over the comms. "I'm sending you my position." "Affirmative," Dalton replied. "A lot of Rukpli are soon going to be coming through that hole," Courier remarked. Stanley nodded. He and Courier would be unable to stop the Rukpli, especially if those Rukpli with the back-mounted weapons were to emerge. They needed more reinforcements. Stanley gestured forward as he began to inch slowly towards the hole. The drilling sound became more intense as they neared the hole. Once they were within the perimeter of the hole, Stanley raised his right hand. He got a good look at the hole. It wasn't big enough yet, but that would change soon. He was unable to determine if the drilling was done by a machine or by one of the Rukpli aliens. A movement on the other end of the corridor caught his attention. Dalton and a team of officers had made it. They had their weapons in front of them. Stanley gestured with his fingers and pointed at the hole. Dalton acknowledged. Stanley stepped away and opened his comms to Diaz. "We have a hole being drilled in the lower deck of the station." "Captain, our sensors picked it up," Diaz replied. "A small vessel appears to have clamped itself against that part of the station." Stanley's eyes narrowed. "How small?" "It's approximately the size of one of our shuttles," Diaz said. "There are more of them approaching the space station. I got the teams to go to those locations. We are also trying to destroy them before they reach the station. But those vessels are quick and able to dodge our weapons fire." As he closed the comms, Stanley stared at Courier in confusion. "What's wrong?" Courier asked. Stanley pointed at the hole. "It's a small, shuttle-like vessel. I don't understand." He was interrupted by a whirring sound. A drone popped up from the hole and began targeting them. "Take cover," Stanley shouted as the drone unleashed its weapons on them. He rolled onto the corridor floor and fired back at the drone. Courier jumped over his body and hit the drone with a weapon. Stanley couldn't believe how she was able to avoid the weapon's fire. The drone began spinning around. Courier rolled away as Dalton and his team fired on the drone. The drone exploded in a ball of flames and its debris fell onto the corridor floor. Stanley was about to stand up when two more drones appeared and began firing at them. This time the two drones split up, one moving in their direction and the other towards Dalton and his team. Both drones began unleashing a torrent of weapons fire. Chapter 9. Lower Decks, Armstrong Station. "Fall back," Stanley shouted as he rolled away from the weapons fire. He hoped that Dalton had heard his command. The drone continued to target Stanley. At one point he felt heat near his ears, only to realize that the drone's weapons fire had hit the corridor wall behind him. He continued to stagger backwards while returning weapons fire. Fortunately, the drone didn't have much room to maneuver in. Courier and his weapons fire continued to hit the drone from different sides. Then a Rukpli emerged from inside the hole. Stanley frowned. The drones had been sent to keep them preoccupied. The Rukpli didn't have a back-mounted weapon. Stanley suppressed a sigh of relief. But the Rukpli turned to look in the direction of Dalton and the team and began firing its energy weapon at them. "We are pinned down here," Courier shouted. Stanley didn't need her to tell that fact. He kept firing at the drone, but the drone was learning. It now knew how to evade their weapons fire even within the confines of the narrow corridor. "We cannot let that hole remain," Courier yelled. What was with her? Why was she telling him the obvious? He also knew they had to shut that hole down before more Rukpli emerged. If the Rukpli began running freely throughout the space station, it would end in a bloodbath. Stanley looked past the drone. Dalton and his team had fallen back to the lift. They were taking a lot of weapons fire from the Rukpli and the drone at their end of the corridor. The Rukpli alien continued to approach them slowly with the other drone at its side. "I have a plan," Stanley said. He pulled out a grenade and showed it to Courier. She didn't understand what he was about to do. "Cover me," Stanley said. He stood and threw the grenade at the other drone. The grenade flew across the hole and hit the drone and exploded. The ball of flames caught the Rukpli alien by surprise. It stumbled to the side slightly before turning its attention towards Stanley. The Rukpli alien growled and began firing at him. "I don't think that was a good plan," Courier remarked. Stanley frowned at her as he stepped back. The drone on their side stopped firing as the Rukpli alien marched in their direction. The drone was being controlled by the Rukpli. Stanley didn't know how that was happening, but it was. "Any other ideas?" Courier asked as she continued to return fire without retreating. For a moment, Stanley felt that Courier was being sarcastic, but he pushed that thought aside as more weapons fire roared past him. Stanley admired Courier's courage. The female Robinto didn't give an inch to the oncoming Rukpli alien and his drone. It was like she felt invincible. He didn't know where she mustered such courage. Maybe the years of fighting the Rukpli and being their captive had hardened her. Would that be the future for humanity? Would the Rukpli also enslave them and make them mine the Trebium, nothing was impossible. Stanley refused to let his fears overcome him. He wasn't going to allow humanity to be enslaved by the Rukpli. I know what we need to do, Korea shouted. As she said that, the head of another Rukpli began to appear from the hole. Before Stanley could ask her, Korea raced towards the Rukpli alien, firing her weapon straight at it. The unforeseen movement made the Rukpli alien pause for a second. Stanley's mouth hung open as Korea used that second to jump at the Rukpli alien and kick the weapon out of his hands. The Rukpli alien tried to grab her by the legs, but she was too fast. She kicked his head and pushed it backwards towards the hole. Stanley realized what Korea was trying to do. He stood and darted forward, firing at the drone. The drone exploded into a ball of flames as the Rukpli alien and the Korea fought with each other. But what Korea intended to do didn't happen. The Rukpli alien tripped backwards and hit the other Rukpli alien trying to come out of the hole. They both went crashing down the hole. To Stanley's horror, the Rukpli alien didn't let go of Korea and she also disappeared down the hole. Chapter 10, Southern Perimeter, Arcadia. Peter sat in front of a console in a makeshift office. Glancing around the space, it was a far cry from an office. The rocky ground of the southern perimeter as the floor could easily attest to that. He had ordered crews to take several units with her to the Trebium mine. No one could dispute that the Rukpli ground invasion would include the Trebium mine itself. The Rukpli had tried before and failed, but this time he knew that the Rukpli would send a larger force to the Trebium mine. Crews had also been ordered to take as many emitters as possible. Peters knew she and her units would need it, far more than he and the other units stationed here at the southern perimeter. Peters stared at the white package beside the console. It had arrived a little while ago. The sender had been Humphreys. Peters had chosen not to open it, at least not until he spoke to Humphreys. Peters opened the holoscreen and Humphreys' face appeared on it. I assume you got my package, Humphreys smiled. Peters nodded. Did you open it? Not yet, that's why I called you. I sent you the first vials of the serum, Humphreys commented. Peters' eyes widened. You mean you found a way for us to prevent the Rukpli body jumps? Humphreys raised his hands. Don't get your hopes up yet. It's experimental, and I haven't tested it on anyone yet. Did you start making more of these? Peters asked. Humphreys seemed annoyed by his question. Of course I did. There's more than enough for all your units. Peters was impressed by Humphreys' efficiency. Somehow Humphreys found a way through when none seemed possible. Peters wasn't sure how it had been achieved. Humphreys must have seen his facial expression. We have a lot of technology on Euphra that allows us to mass produce these serums quickly. It was a matter of finding the right ratio that worked to neutralize the Rukpli cells. The chief scientist made it sound so simple, but Peters suspected the man must have worked endlessly on it. I need you to send a few packs of the serum to the Trebium mine immediately. Lieutenant Cruz and some units are on the way there right now. Got it, Captain. I'll ship it out right away. Peters looked back at the package. So, this hasn't been tested on a human yet? It has been injected into a human here. We haven't observed any side effects so far, but we don't know if it works or not. I need a human to fight against the Rukpli to see if the serum will stop the body jumps. Peters frowned. I was told that you have a Rukpli prisoner in your custody, Humphreys mused. Yes, but we cannot use it, Peters said firmly. He had thought of it the moment Humphreys had mentioned the need to test the serum, but that was out of the question. Why not? Humphreys asked, visibly irritated. Peters suspected Humphreys had sent him the package with the intention to test it on a human and the Rukpli prisoner. The Rukpli prisoner serves another critical purpose and is being prepared for the incoming attack, Peters said. He didn't want to be distracted by anything that could go wrong with the Rukpli prisoner. If the serum didn't work, it could lead to the Rukpli prisoner escaping and causing a lot more destruction. This wasn't the time for that. Peters needed all of his soldiers to be focused on the incoming attack and nothing else. I understand, Humphrey said. Then we do not have any other way to test it until the actual attack happens. Peters observed the resigned look over Humphrey's face. What's your gut feeling on whether this serum will work? I'm a scientist. I don't work on gut feelings. But you must have a sense, right? Humphreys remained stubborn. I cannot exactly give you a figure. What would people think of me if I did? Humphrey's words rattled Peters. He tried to control himself. He didn't want to end up in an argument with the scientist. Doctor, I don't care about your reputation. If we cannot stop the Rukpli here and now, there may be no humanity left on this planet soon to care about your reputation. Fine, Humphrey sighed. It has about an 80% chance of success. 80% is more than Peters had anticipated, and knowing Humphrey's history of success, Peters would take that figure. Thank you for your hard work, Peter said. I'll take the serum myself. Captain, it's experimental, Humphreys warned. It's our only chance, Peter said. Humphrey's face softened. One last thing. I heard about your father. I'm sorry for your loss. Peters nodded and closed the holoscreen. Chapter 11, Rukpli Vessel, Diastro System. General Myers stood at one end of a chamber. He could sense the Rukpli inside of him controlling every movement. Despite that, the Rukpli inside of him seemed to have loosened its control over him, at least momentarily. Bring him here, a loud voice boomed from the other end of the chamber. Myers stood his ground in defiance, but a sharp pain rebuked his stubbornness. He felt the power of the Rukpli inside of him assert itself again. Against his will, Myers felt his body begin to approach the other end of the chamber. Each of his legs seemed out of his control. As his legs marched forward, Myers had a flashback to the last few hours. He recalled the bridge of the USS Trident being taken over by the Rukpli aliens. Commander Gomez had been taken away. Myers didn't know whether Gomez and the civilians were dead. Myers hadn't heard a sound from them. He had then been taken into a shuttle that had landed on this larger Rukpli vessel. The Rukpli inside of him had kept a tight control over him until he had stepped into this dimly lit chamber. There were no windows nor furniture in this chamber. Myers felt the coldness touch his skin. He himself also didn't know why he was being kept alive, but he knew he was about to find out. Myers felt his legs come to an abrupt stop. It was like a force inside of him was operating his legs. He stared ahead. There was a blue circular projection in front of him. The size of the projection reminded him of those full-length mirrors from Earth. In it was a hooded figure wearing a black robe. "Welcome, General Myers," the hooded figure announced. Myers felt the Rukpli inside of him again loosen its control over his body. The feeling was strange. It was like something had unwrapped itself from his body. "Don't look so surprised that we know about you," the hooded figure chided. Myers found that he was able to move his mouth on his own. "How do you know my name?" "I know many things about you," the hooded figure said. "Who are you?" Myers asked. He sensed this was a Rukpli leader, but he wanted the figure to say it out loud. "I am the Supreme Leader of the Rukpli," the hooded figure replied. Myers didn't flinch. "So you are the one calling all the shots." The Supreme Leader stared at him. "I don't care much for your human concepts, but I am the one who leads my species." "Where are the people in my vessel?" Myers demanded. He felt something wrap around his chest. For a second, he thought he would collapse from a lack of oxygen. "If you're wondering whether they are dead, my answer is not yet," the Supreme Leader scowled. Myers didn't like playing games with this Rukpli leader. The Rukpli leader was after something, but he couldn't discern what it wanted. If not, Myers expected he would have been dead already. Just another casualty in a war for the planet. "Why am I here?" Myers asked. "You are not in a position to ask so many questions," the Supreme Leader sneered. Myers refused to be threatened by this monster. "Why don't you kill me and get it over with?" The Supreme Leader laughed. "Kill you? Did you think that I brought you here for that? I didn't execute an elaborate plan to get my seed into your vessel so that I could simply kill you. You are alive for a reason." "Which is what?" "So that I can decide whether to enslave your species or eradicate it," the Supreme Leader said. Chapter 12, Rukpli Vessel Diastro System. Myers couldn't tell if the Rukpli inside of him could sense his fear, enslavement or eradication. Was that even a choice? Neither of them helped humanity, although some would argue that enslavement would at least prolong the survival of the species. He recalled the reports submitted on the Rebinto species. They had been enslaved but appeared to have survived to tell their stories. Maybe enslavement wasn't a bad situation. Myers couldn't believe he was even contemplating it. "We were leaving your planet," Myers remarked. The Supreme Leader raised his voice. "The Rukpli didn't care whether you were leaving or not. You were trespassing on our planet. The judgment for such violations is always death." Myers kept quiet. There was no point debating with this monster. The Rukpli aliens only seemed to care about destroying species who didn't follow their predetermined rules. No one knew that the planet belonged to the Rukpli. Despite that, the planet was considered theirs. Myers found the whole argument ridiculous. "Don't you want to know?" the Supreme Leader asked. "Know what?" Again the games. Myers was tempted to shout at the alien but restrained himself. Why couldn't the Supreme Leader get to the point? "Why aren't you dead?" the Supreme Leader asked. Myers refused to be drawn into the aliens' games. If the alien wanted an answer, he wasn't going to give one. If the alien decided to kill him, so be it. I will show you why, the Supreme Leader said. Then another projection appeared beside the current one with the Supreme Leader. Initially, it was blurry. Then the second projection became clearer and Myers' blood ran cold. The second projection had an image of his son, Peters. Myers tried to clench his fist but couldn't. I don't know what you're trying to do, but it won't work. Myers sensed that the Rukpli inside of him was laughing at him. Myers didn't know how it was even possible for him to know that, but somehow he did. It was a strange feeling knowing something was inside of you, but you had no control over it. Won't it? The Supreme Leader snickered. Myers frowned. The Supreme Leader was taunting him by showing Peter's image on the projection. You should thank your son, as you humans call him, the Supreme Leader remarked. He is the reason that you and those civilians haven't been eradicated. Myers blinked in confusion. What was the Rukpli Leader talking about? What did Peters have to do with anything? Peters wasn't here. He was back on Euphra. Myers imagined his son would be mourning the loss of his father. Myers sighed, knowing that the last words he had spoken to his son had been so unlike him. The whole episode of breaking the chain of command had really gotten under his skin. But now, looking back, it was irrelevant. He regretted leaving things like that with his son. It had been a serious mistake, and there would be no way to fix it. Not unless he escaped from the Rukpli, which was unlikely. I'm quite intrigued by him, the Supreme Leader said. His ability to foresee my kind's moves is impressive. It's because of that I have decided to spare your species from eradication. What do you mean? Myers inquired. The Supreme Leader tilted his head. Aren't you known as Earth's greatest general or something? I expected more from you. Myers was taken back. How did the Rukpli Leader know so many details about humanity? It was as if the Rukpli Leader had been spying on their every word. It was impossible. But Myers realized this Rukpli Leader had some way to reach into Euphra at every level. If not, there was no way it could know such details about him. Your son's actions paved the way for humanity, the Supreme Leader grinned. For a moment, Myers observed a flash of something that looked like teeth, but they were sharper than that and didn't look like they were made of teeth. The teeth looked like they were made of a carbon-like mineral. The Supreme Leader swung his right hand. Since you failed to ask me any further questions, enslavement it will be. You may leave now. Myers felt the Rukpli inside of him taking charge again as he was forced to turn around and begin the long walk back to exit the chamber. As he was marched back by the Rukpli within him, the sound of laughter erupted behind him. Chapter 13, Rukpli Shuttle, Euphra Orbit. The moment Korea realized she was going through the hole, she closed her eyes and clutched her weapon. She had been unable to get herself away from the hold of the Rukpli alien. Her intention had been to drop the Rukpli alien back down the hole into his ship, but that had gone horribly wrong. Instead, she had plunged alongside the Rukpli alien into its ship. She landed with a thud against one of the walls of the shuttle. She felt a slight pain on her shoulder, but quickly opened her eyes and looked around. The wall had broken her fall. However, she found her head pressed against a bulkhead. A few meters in front of her was the Rukpli alien she had tried to push away back down the hole. The Rukpli alien's head was pointed down. She was glad that it wasn't awake. Korea tried to move her head, but she realized it was wedged tightly against the bulkhead. She was about to shift her head around when a sound caught her attention. The Rukpli alien in front of her was moving its head. Korea closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep. She listened carefully. The sound of the Rukpli alien getting to its feet invaded her ears. Then she felt a presence in front of her. Korea quieted her breathing and tried her best to stay calm. The last thing she needed was for the Rukpli to kill her on board this shuttle. She needed to find a way back onto the space station. Another sound interrupted her thoughts. It was another Rukpli alien. She suspected it had to be the one who had tried to emerge out of the hole. Is the Rabinto dead? The first Rukpli voice asked. Not yet, a second Rukpli voice hissed. We don't have time to deal with the Rabinto, the first Rukpli admitted. We have new orders. Close the hatch and disengage with the human station. What do we do with the Rabinto? The second Rukpli voice inquired. She is not awake, the first Rukpli said. If she awakens and becomes a problem, we will terminate her. With that, the two voices became softer. Then the sound of the hatch being closed caught her attention. Korea suppressed a sigh. She was trapped in a Rukpli shuttle without a way back onto the space station. She kept her eyes closed and began thinking. Had she been too impulsive in trying to stop the Rukpli? She needed to take control of this shuttle and kill the two Rukpli aliens. She hoped that there were only two Rukpli on board. The hum of the engines broke her thoughts. The Rukpli shuttle was leaving the space station. Chapter 14, Armstrong Station, Euphra orbit. Stanley spoke into his comms as he waited for the lift to rise. Commander, what's the closest intrusion point by a Rukpli vessel to my position? Sending the location over now, Diaz replied. Our sensors indicate that the Rukpli vessel and its Rukpli that you were fighting against has disengaged from the space station. After Korea had disappeared down the hole, Stanley had raced over only to find that the Rukpli vessel had shut its hatch door. Stanley tried vainly banging against the hatch door, but it had been futile. He had never before been so helpless. Korea was trapped inside with those Rukpli. Although the Rukpli couldn't body jump into her, they would attack her. He didn't know if she could weather such an attack, but he had to assume Korea would be able to take care of herself, even within the confines of a Rukpli vessel. Once Stanley had heard the Rukpli vessel's engines come to life, he had ordered Diaz to seal off the area and send a team down to repair the breach. We're also noticing that the other Rukpli vessels seem to be getting ready to disengage from the space station, Diaz commented. Stanley could only presume the Rukpli vessels that had tried to breach the space station were receiving new orders. He didn't know what those orders were, but that didn't concern him right now. The lift doors opened and Stanley raced down a corridor. The sound of weapons fire could be heard to the left of the corridor. Stanley turned and found a team engaged with one Rukpli alien. The Rukpli alien wasn't advancing. Instead, it was slowly retreating to another hole. I'm going after Korea, Stanley whispered over the comms. He didn't want to distract the crew engaged with the Rukpli alien. Captain, that isn't a good idea, Diaz countered. I cannot let her die with the Rukpli, Stanley declared. Not after she saved my life. Stanley, we need you on this space station, Diaz insisted. I don't know what else the Rukpli will be sending against us, but I believe this is only the beginning. I need your presence and help on board this station. Diaz was sounding too much like Mendez. Stanley was glad Mendez wasn't around. If not, he would have heard an earful from Mendez about again risking his life unnecessarily. But this wasn't unnecessary. He wasn't about to let Korea be just another casualty in this attack by the Rukpli. Korea and the Rabinto species had helped him. He refused to abandon her. Korea can take care of herself, Diaz continued. Without you here, I might not be able to hold Armstrong Station. Stanley had to admit that there was some truth behind Diaz's words, but his need to help Korea seemed to overwhelm his senses and mind. Stanley ignored her plea. I'll update you once I retrieve Korea. You need to hold Armstrong Station until I'm back. With that, Stanley shut off his comms and turned his attention back to the team fighting the Rukpli alien. Where's the other Rukpli alien? Stanley asked the team lead officer. Sir, we managed to kill it, the team lead officer replied. That Rukpli is the only one left. The team lead officer spoke with such confidence. But how could he be sure there weren't any more Rukpli aliens inside that hole, waiting in their vessel? On my signal, I want you to throw your grenades at the Rukpli and cover me after that, Stanley ordered. Yes, sir, the team lead officer said nervously. Stanley could see it in his eyes. The team lead officer knew something was happening that wasn't prudent or sanctioned. Despite that, the man obeyed the command. Now, Stanley shouted. Several grenades flew into the air. The Rukpli alien initially looked confused at the multiple grenades being thrown at it. Before the Rukpli alien could react, a series of explosions rocked the corridor. The Rukpli alien began to stagger around the hole. Stanley couldn't afford to let the Rukpli alien fall back into that hole. If that happened, he would have a bigger fight on his hands instead of recovering Korea. Stanley raced forward while the Rukpli alien was still recovering from the aftermath of the explosions. He kicked the Rukpli alien in the chest several times until the alien toppled beyond the hole onto the other end of the corridor. Stanley turned to the team leader. Fire upon him now. Then Stanley jumped into the hole. Chapter 15, Operation Center, Armstrong Station. Commander Diaz sighed as the comms with Stanley ended. She tried to connect back with him, but she couldn't. Why did Stanley have to be so stubborn? She had to admit that Korea was important, but this wasn't the way to go about it. There were other ways to help Korea, but Stanley didn't seem to agree with her. Diaz couldn't afford to lose Stanley in the process. Stanley could have gotten someone else to help him rescue Korea. Why did it have to be himself? She had heard of his stubbornness from Mendez when they had reached the fringe of the Warrior system. However, she never expected having to face it with him. Stanley needed to stay on Armstrong Station. Korea was one individual. He couldn't choose her over the station. She tried again to open a comms with Stanley, but the connection failed. She could only assume he was blocking all incoming connections. Diaz was frustrated. With the ongoing assault on the space station, Stanley's rescue attempt was the last thing she wanted to handle. This was the worst possible time for him to be a hero. Lieutenant Sherry turned to her. Commander, yes, all the Rukpli vessels that attached to us and drilled a hole in our station are gone. Sherry announced. Are you certain? Diaz asked. Affirmative. I have sealed off all those sections. Get repair teams out there to those positions immediately, Diaz ordered. I want the breaches sealed as soon as possible. She gazed out at the view screen. The number of drones had begun to diminish. Diaz was relieved. It was apparent the Rukpli vessels didn't have an infinite supply of drones. A few point defense cannons had been blown to bits. However, the remaining ones had done their job on the drones. The drilling of the holes had caught her by surprise. She didn't know why the Rukpli had chosen that approach in assaulting Armstrong Station. To her, it seemed like it was a more complicated way to attack the station. There had to be a reason why the Rukpli chose the approach they did. It was possible their transportation mechanism had some issue. If there was any truth to that, Diaz was glad. If the Rukpli had materialized on board the space station at different locations, the humans and the Rabinto species could have been overwhelmed. The larger Rukpli vessels were still floating around the space station. None of them had further fired their weapons. The reality was that they didn't need to. With the shields down, the space station was a sitting target. The Rukpli aliens could easily take the space station if they wanted to. I don't like it, Sherry said. What? The waiting, Sherry commented. Why are those vessels still waiting? I know what you mean, Diaz sighed. She was still distracted by Stanley's reckless act, but didn't plan on reporting it to Admiral Sheldon. She could only hope that Stanley was successful in his attempt to rescue Korea, although she didn't even know how he was going to achieve that. Do we know the current position of all those Rukpli shuttles that were attached to us? Diaz asked. They are dispersing, Sherry replied. Sensors indicate some returning to the larger Rukpli vessels while others are holding position away from us. Can you isolate the Rukpli shuttle holding Korea? Diaz asked. Ever since the attack on Stanley and Korea, Diaz had insisted on them wearing a band that would help track their location. She knew that Stanley would use that to find the female Rabinto. While it was a reasonable approach, no one even knew whether Korea was still alive or not. By the time Stanley found her, it might be too late. Sensors indicate she is. Sherry's voice trailed off. A loud sound emerged right behind her. Diaz turned, but she was too late. A Rukpli alien materialized and touched Sherry's neck. Sherry's body dissolved into nothing. Diaz pulled out a weapon and began firing at the Rukpli alien. The Rukpli alien sneered and turned in her direction. You foolish humans. The Rukpli alien scowled. Your end is coming. Diaz fired a weapon again, but the Rukpli alien managed to dodge her weapon's fire. It was quicker than she had anticipated. Then it was gone. Diaz walked over to the station where Sherry had been. There was no trace of her. She was gone. Dead. Another casualty. How many more would there be before this Rukpli invasion was over? Diaz clenched her jaw. Sherry had been a loyal crew member. Ever since Diaz had been promoted to lead Armstrong Station, she had become closer to Sherry of all her crew members. Why couldn't she have been faster to kill the Rukpli? She should have done something to save Sherry. Anger began to rise within her, but she had to keep it in check. This wasn't the time to mourn or deal with Sherry's death. She needed to stay in control of her emotions. She pushed those thoughts aside. At the same time, it dawned on her about what had happened to Admiral Harris and the rest on the space station during the initial Rukpli attack. Alerts began appearing on Sherry's station. Diaz sat down and looked at the console. The warnings indicated the arrival of new vessels. Alarms began to join the alerts in tandem. Diaz looked up at the view screen and gasped. Two much larger Rukpli vessels had appeared and were making their way towards Euphra. Chapter 16, Bridge UFS Intrepid. Commander Mendez opened an incoming comms at Armstrong Station. It was Diaz. Commander, we just spotted two larger Rukpli vessels making their way to Euphra, Diaz announced. Affirmative, Mendez said. Our sensors detected their arrival. What about the other vessels surrounding the space station? None of them have moved from their original positions, Diaz commented. They have also stopped firing on us. Mendez grimaced. Those Rukpli vessels around Armstrong Station have been waiting for the arrival of the larger vessels. They distracted us, Mendez mused. I don't understand, Diaz muttered. The surrounding of Armstrong Station, the releasing of the drones and the smaller shuttles, drilling into the station were all just a means to keep us busy, Mendez remarked. Until their arrival, we'll engage the larger Rukpli vessels. With that, he switched off the comms. He then turned to the navigation officer. Break orbit and lay an intercept course to the two larger Rukpli vessels. Aye, Captain, the navigation officer replied. The comms officer turned to Mendez. The UFS Winston is asking whether they should join us. Negative, Mendez replied. Ask the UFS Winston to hold position and cover this part of space. The Rukpli were clever. Mendez didn't know if the appearance of the two larger Rukpli vessels was also another ploy to get their vessels away from Euphra. I've informed them, the sensor officer replied. The UFS Winston also didn't have an experienced crew. The attack at the fringe of the one-year system had taken out more than half of their bridge crew. It would be better for that vessel and the crew to stay where they were and protect Euphra from any other Rukpli vessels. What's our ETA? Mendez asked. 5 minutes, sir, the navigation officer replied. Power up our weapons and be ready to engage, Mendez ordered. Aye, Captain, the tactical officer replied. Ever since the UFS Intrepid had withdrawn from Armstrong Station, Mendez had been waiting for the opportunity to take on the Rukpli. Now that opportunity had arrived, and he couldn't wait to engage them. He had briefly heard reports of Armstrong Station being invaded by the Rukpli shuttle-like vessels. However, those vessels had all but left the space station. He then received a comms from Diaz. Yes, Commander. Why did Diaz have to keep disturbing him? Didn't she understand he was about to attack the Rukpli? He didn't have time to listen to her concerns. There's one more thing I forgot to inform you, Diaz said. Mendez sensed her voice was shaky. It's about Captain Stanley, Diaz whispered. Mendez inhaled the breath sharply. He already knew that whatever Diaz was going to share wasn't going to be good. He listened as Diaz explained what had happened with Korea. Mendez frowned. Do we know where the captain is at present? I'm checking on his whereabouts and will update you again, Diaz said. Mendez shook his head in dismay. Again, Stanley had taken things into his own hands without thinking of the repercussions. Hadn't he learned anything from the fringe of the one-year system? It was obvious Stanley hadn't. Mendez clenched his jaw. When would Stanley learn anything if they all even survived this Rukpli invasion? Mendez didn't have time to think of Stanley. The captain was on his own. Mendez hated having to think such a thought. His duty was to serve his captain, but now he was facing a bigger problem. Prevent those larger Rukpli vessels from reaching the surface. Commander, we're approaching the vessels, the navigation officer reported. Mendez turned his gaze back to the view screen. The moment his eyes set on those two larger Rukpli vessels, he knew what they were for. Those two Rukpli vessels were troop carriers. He didn't know how many Rukpli aliens were on board, but no matter what, he couldn't let them land on Euphra. Fire on them now, Mendez ordered. Chapter 17, Rukpli vessel near Armstrong Station. Stanley had managed to slide himself into pilot's chair of the Rukpli vessel. There had been no other Rukpli aliens on board when he jumped down the hole. Fortunately, he was able to recall the meanings of the symbols and managed to close the hatch door and disengage from Armstrong Station. Once he got the engines going, he opened the comms with Diaz. Commander? Initially, he didn't hear anything. Had the comms failed? Another sneaky thought flirted with his mind. Was Diaz avoiding him? He had to admit that his last conversation had ended badly. Diaz had been strongly opposed to him leaving the station, but he had refused to explain his rationale to her. She wouldn't understand. Stanley owed his life to Korea. He couldn't just stand aside and let the Rukpli abduct her. He had to do something. It was that simple. Then Diaz's voice emerged. Stanley, is that you? Yes, I'm inside one of the Rukpli shuttle, Stanley replied. The sigh of relief in Diaz's voice was so clear that he nearly chuckled, but that would have been inappropriate. The Rukpli transported over here and took out Sherry, Diaz admitted. Stanley was stunned. That explained the delay in the comms with the operations center of Armstrong Station. How many came over, Stanley asked. Just one, and he targeted Sherry, but it's gone now. There must be some limitation as to why only one of them was able to transport over. I believe so, Stanley agreed. The Rukpli aliens were facing an issue. Stanley wished he knew what it was because then they could take advantage of it. Can you handle the operations center, Stanley asked. Yes. I need to know the exact location of Korea, Stanley said. Diaz didn't argue with him this time. Sending it over to you. According to the sensor readings, she's on a shuttle on the starboard side of the station. Her vitals are okay. Stanley exhaled. He had been waiting to hear that from Diaz. Korea was still alive, at least for the moment. The risk he had taken by jumping into his Rukpli vessel had been worth it. He had a chance to save her. Affirmative, I'm going after that Rukpli shuttle, Stanley commented. I need you to handle the teams on the space station. Diaz acknowledged and switched off the comms. It seemed that she had given up on him. Stanley felt that was a better use of her time. Diaz needed to focus on the space station while he rescued Korea. He seemed so confident despite lacking any plan. It was nothing new. Anyone who really knew him would have been able to understand. But the problem was that Stanley hadn't let many people get close to him during his training days. He had done it intentionally, preferring to get the work done without relying on others. However, for those trainings that required working in a team, Stanley had put in the effort to ensure no one would see through him. Stanley could attribute his present behavior to his upbringing as a single child. His parents had done their best for him, but that had also bred in him his desire to excel as an individual. He wasn't blaming his parents. Instead, his parents had made him who he was today. The fact that he had made captain had been shocking to his parents. The truth was that his posting to be captain had more to do with Admiral Harris than anyone or anything else. Harris had been able to see through the facade he had successfully built. Harris had gotten to know the real Stanley, and yet Harris had allowed him to grow, which had initially worried Stanley. Over time, he had gotten used to Harris's mentoring and realized that Harris had cleverly and subtly pushed him to work better with others. Despite that, past habits were the hardest to kill. The Rukpli attack had again brought out his old nature of going about things in his own ways. Stanley shut his thoughts on the past and looked back at the Rukpli console. He took control and began navigating the shuttle to the starboard side of Armstrong Station. Chapter 18, Rukpli Vessel Euphra Orbit. As Stanley navigated the Rukpli vessel around the space station, he noticed that the drones were no longer there. He had heard of the attack by the drones on his way to engineering, but he was surprised they were gone. He assumed that the point defense cannons had done their job in destroying all the drones, and it appeared that the Rukpli vessels encircling Armstrong Station had stopped sending out more drones. His eyes then widened. In front of him were a dozen more Rukpli vessels similar to the one he was in. All of them were holding position and waiting. How was he going to be able to find the exact vessel holding Korea? Stanley retrieved the position that Diaz had sent him. He studied the position carefully and looked at his view screen. He breathed a sigh of relief. In the position's vicinity, there was only one Rukpli vessel. It had to be that one. He navigated his vessel in that direction until it was close enough to the other Rukpli vessel. Then Stanley opened fire on the vessel, but his intention was not to destroy it, but to disable it. The Rukpli vessel took evasive actions and managed to dodge his weapons fire. Then a series of alerts wailed inside his Rukpli vessel. Another Rukpli vessel closer to him had begun to unleash bursts of weapons fire upon his vessel. Stanley gritted his teeth. The Rukpli aliens must have figured out that someone else had commandeered this vessel. He took evasive countermeasures to avoid the weapons fire and was fortunate none of them hit his vessel. The Rukpli vessel holding Korea within it began to accelerate. Stanley clenched his jaw. The Rukpli aliens knew he was coming after their female Rabinto prisoner. Stanley pushed on his vessel as it jumped forward in pursuit of the Rukpli vessel. None of the weapons fire touched his vessel. The countermeasures had worked. However, he didn't know if the other Rukpli vessel would stop its pursuit of him. As if to answer his thought, a shudder rolled through his vessels. Stanley grimaced. The other Rukpli vessel wasn't giving up. He kept one eye on the Rukpli vessel holding Korea as it entered Euphra's atmosphere. Another wave of warnings sounded in front of him. Incoming missiles. Stanley pulled on the controls as the vessel swerved hard to the starboard side while he launched more countermeasures. By now, his vessel was streaking down through Euphra's atmosphere. The Rukpli vessel holding Korea was straight ahead of him. He began targeting and firing on its engines. The Rukpli vessel was able to avoid his weapons fire. He fired one missile and a volley of weapons fire. The Rukpli vessel swerved to the left to avoid the missile, but the weapons fire hit one of its engines. Smoke began to emerge from the tail of the Rukpli shuttle. Stanley stopped firing and was about to ease off when an explosion rocked him. If not for his restraints, he would have slammed into the view screen. A plethora of alerts were ringing all around him. One of the missiles from his pursuer must have found its mark. Stanley tried his best to steady the rapidly descending vessel. The Rukpli vessel holding Korea was also struggling to maintain control. The ground expanded quickly on the view screen as his vessel continued to descend. Stanley pressed on the buttons of the console, hoping to get back more control. He didn't understand every one of the Rukpli symbols, but tried his best to discern the appropriate button. Then his vessel touched down furiously and tipped over. Chapter 19, Bridge UFS Intrepid. Commander, the first Rukpli vessel is firing missiles, a tactical officer reported. Deploy countermeasures, Mendez ordered. Affirmative, the tactical officer said. Mendez felt the UFS Intrepid lurch as the countermeasures were deployed. The second larger Rukpli vessel seemed to be not moving while the first one did all the firing. That was strange. Beam incoming, a tactical officer shouted. The UFS Intrepid swerved sharply. Mendez grabbed hold of the sides of the captain's chair to keep himself from stumbling onto the ground. Did we get hit? Mendez barked. Negative, the tactical officer replied. Mendez recalled how a previous encounter with the Rukpli vessel at the fringe of the warning system had shut down their power. He had his engineers improvise on the shield so as to keep its frequencies changing every minute. Hit them with our slugs, Mendez ordered. Firing another round, the tactical officer reported. The beam hit us, the sensor officer admitted. Mendez glanced around the bridge. The shield modulation was working. The beam hadn't been able to penetrate and shut down their power. Commander, the second vessel is accelerating, the sensor officer announced. Target the second vessel now, Mendez barked. We have incoming missiles from the first vessel, the tactical officer reported. We need to evade them. Mendez nodded as he slammed his fist on the side of the captain's chair. The Rukpli vessel had him in a corner. The UFS Winston is incoming, the sensor officer observed. It's on an intercept course with the second Rukpli vessel. Mendez frowned. What? Tell them to change course now. He knew the UFS Winston wasn't as prepared to engage the Rukpli vessels as the UFS Intrepid. What was the crew of the UFS Winston doing? He had explicitly told them to stay at their position and not be drawn into this battle. The young lieutenant in charge hadn't even been promoted to an XO yet. What the heck was he doing trying to be a hero? Sir, the second vessel is launching missiles and the beam at the UFS Winston, the sensor officer said. Open a comms with the UFS Winston, Mendez ordered, exasperation dripping from his mouth. He had lost all patience with these younger crew members. None of them understood the art of being patient. I cannot connect to them, the comms officer replied. Mendez eyed the view screen. The UFS Winston was no longer moving. It appeared to be floating out there in space. Can someone tell me what's going on with the UFS Winston, Mendez asked. The sensor officer turned to him. I think they lost power. The Rukpli beam must have shut down their power and shields, just like what they had encountered at the fringe of the warning system. No, wait, they're moving, the sensor officer countered. Mendez narrowed his eyes. The UFS Winston was moving in an unusual course. Then it dawned on him about what was happening. The second Rukpli vessel was using the UFS Winston as cover and moving both vessels. From the stern to the bow, the UFS Winston managed to shield the second Rukpli vessel perfectly. Someone looking at the UFS Winston wouldn't have known that it was shielding another vessel. The Rukpli vessel had luck on their side. The unexpected intervention by the UFS Winston had given an opening to the Rukpli. Can we get a clear shot at the second Rukpli vessel, Mendez hollered. No, sir, the tactical officer replied. We might indirectly hit the UFS Winston. Meanwhile, Mendez felt the UFS Intrepid swerve again as it avoided another round of incoming missiles from the first Rukpli vessel. Somebody give me a plan to stop the two Rukpli vessels, Mendez shouted. We cannot let them reach the surface. A silence fell over the bridge. Mendez sighed. The Rukpli vessel had been able to outmaneuver them. Chapter 20. Outside of Arcadia, Euphra. Stanley opened his eyes. He was staring at the ceiling of the Rukpli shuttle. The smell of smoke invaded his senses. Fortunately, he was still buckled into his chair. That alone must have saved him from certain death upon impact. He tried shifting in his chair but realized his right leg was trapped under some wreckage. Stanley looked around and grabbed a piece of metal on one side. He shoved the metal piece below the wreckage and tried to use it as a lever to lift the wreckage that had trapped his leg. Initially, nothing happened. Then Stanley exerted more pressure and he felt the wreckage move ever so slightly. That bit of pressure was enough. He pulled out his right leg free of the wreckage and let go of the metal piece. He examined his right leg. It hadn't sustained any serious injuries. Stanley exhaled a sigh of relief. He slowly unbuckled and squirmed himself out of the chair. The Rukpli vessel was upside down. He gave his body a few seconds to orient itself. He stood upright and walked towards the hatch. The sides of the vessels were a mess. Stanley coughed while fanning away the smoke. A Rukpli message was being broadcast throughout the vessel. Although he couldn't understand the broadcast, he guessed it had to do with the system failure on board. There were small electrical fires in some corners of the corridors. Stanley carefully sidestepped the cables protruding out of the walls. He grabbed the Rukpli weapon strapped to the corridor that had managed to survive the crash landing. It looked similar to their standard issue rifle blaster. Once he reached the hatch door, he found it jammed. He kicked it a few times, but nothing happened. Stanley took a few steps back and fired the weapon at the hatch door. Eventually, the hatch door gave way to the burst of weapons fire and he slipped out of the Rukpli vessel. The bright light blinded him momentarily. Stanley blinked his eyes before taking a few steps away from the Rukpli vessel. He glanced back. There was smoke creeping up from every side of the vessel. Stanley counted himself lucky to get out alive. Then an explosion ripped through the front of the vessel. Stanley jumped away and rolled onto the ground as that explosion triggered a few more that traveled the length of the entire Rukpli vessel. He stood and glanced at the vessel. The Rukpli vessel was completely charred and unusable. Then he heard another explosion in the distance. Stanley swirled around and narrowed his eyes. There was smoke rising ahead of him. It had to be the other Rukpli vessel, the one with Korea inside. He broke into a run. His heart began to pound. The sunlight kept reflecting off the other Rukpli vessel as he approached it. This Rukpli vessel hadn't tipped over like his one. Instead, it was mostly intact. He assumed the Rukpli aliens must have been able to land it safely. He slowed down once he was near the front of the vessel. He slowly walked to the hatch door in the rear. The hatch door was open. Smoke was coming out of it. Stanley trained his weapon in front of him and inched closer to the door. Stanley, a voice hissed behind him. Stanley spun around. Korea was sprawled on the ground a few meters away. He ran and knelt beside her. She was breathing haphazardly. He had never been so glad to see her. "Are you injured?" Stanley asked. Korea raised her hand. Stanley staggered backwards as the female Rabinto managed to stand on her own strength. He remained amazed by the resolve of the Robinto species. Their resilience must have emerged from the days of captivity on their planet. Korea turned to him. I'm getting better. I don't think so, Stanley countered, still concerned for her. You don't understand us, Korea retorted. Stanley looked down. Korea softened her face. I didn't mean it like that. Why are you here, though? I came after you, Stanley admitted. Why? The question took Stanley by surprise. I couldn't let the Rukpli take you, Stanley replied. Why? Korea repeated. He felt awkward at her question. Wasn't his answer sufficient? Didn't she get it? You saved my life on board Armstrong Station, Stanley muttered. I had to save you. Did you think I couldn't save myself? Korea asked. That was not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Stanley felt uncomfortable with her questions. Look, we should get cover in case there are other Rukpli vessels roaming about. Korea must have sensed his uneasiness. I didn't mean to make you unhappy. I'm glad you came for me. Any of my species would have left me for dead. I was just shocked to see you here. You mean none of them would have come after you? Stanley asked. Korea shook her head. That is the way of the Robinto species. Everyone is expendable. That isn't the human way, Stanley said as he led her towards some hills where they could take cover. Every one of us is significant. We don't leave people behind. I'm beginning to see that, Korea smirked. You humans are really different. We should be different, Stanley smiled. Korea broke into a trot and then a run. Stanley ran to keep up with the female Robinto. Then the sound of an engine invaded his ears. A vessel was approaching. Chapter 21, Bridge UFS Intrepid. The UFS Intrepid and the first larger Rukpli vessel continued to trade weapons fire. Neither vessel had given any ground, and neither had suffered any hull breaches. It was a stalemate. Mendes frowned. He didn't like the situation. Meanwhile, the greater concern was the movement of the UFS Winston. To some degree, the UFS vessel's movement had considerably slowed down. Does anyone know why the UFS Winston is slowing down? Mendes asked. Would his bridge crew be up to the task? He wasn't asking much of them. Initially, there was another round of silence across the bridge. No one dared to speak up. The veins on Mendes's neck began to arise. Did you all hear my question? Mendes hollered. It isn't an optional question on your academic quiz. Affirmative, a tactical officer replied in a shaky voice. Finally, someone had the guts to speak up. The rest of his bridge crew were being cowards. Mendes would eventually be forced to transform them, one by one, and he would do it. Mendes looked pointedly at the tactical officer. So, what are you saying? It's possible the second Rukpli vessel's traction beam or whatever they are using isn't powerful enough to keep the UFS Winston moving at a constant velocity, the tactical officer observed. Mendes touched his chin. How do we validate your theory? Launch a drone, the sensor officer suggested. How long before the UFS Winston reaches orbit? Mendes asked. At the current velocity, it would take another 30 minutes, the tactical officer reported. Once the UFS Winston reached orbit, the second larger Rukpli vessel would ditch the UFS vessel and head straight down the planet's atmosphere. Mendes couldn't let that happen. We could modify a drone to be a relay for comms to the UFS Winston, the sensor officer said. The drone should be able to pick up local comms if it is sufficiently close. His bridge crew was finally thinking. It was about time. How long will it take? Mendes inquired. He knew the answer, but he was testing his crew. A few minutes, the tactical officer replied. Get engineering to modify the drone and launch it immediately, Mendes barked. Aye, sir, the tactical officer replied. A little while later, the drone was launched towards the stern of the UFS Winston. The tactical officer turned. The drone has reached a close enough distance. Send a comms asking for a report on the vessel, Mendes ordered. Receiving a reply, the tactical officer announced. They indicate that engineering is trying to get power back up, but they do not know how long it will take. Mendes recalled that on the UFS Intrepid it had taken a long while before engineering had restored power. It would be too late if it took that long for the UFS Winston. Ask them whether they can disable the tractor beam or whatever has a hold on them, Mendes asked. The tactical officer gasped. Mendes frowned. What did they say? The Rukpli aren't using a tractor beam, but using larger drones to move the UFS Winston, the tactical officer announced. At least 100 of them. Chapter 22. Cockpit UFS Fighter Ship. Squadron Leader Harris looked at his console. His squadron was approaching the stern of the UFS Winston. The orders had been clear. His squadron was to take out the drones that were moving the UFS Winston. However, they had no visual of what to expect once they were bent about to the other side of the UFS Winston. Sir, do we know how many drones there are? Lieutenant Grayson asked through the comms. Harris was glad to have Grayson back in his squadron. Prior to this, she had been assigned to help Captain Stanley on Armstrong Station, especially with the Robinto species. But Stanley had acceded to his request to have her return to the squadron. Grayson was his most experienced pilot. He needed her to help out with the rest of the squadron. Although they had lost a few during their battles at the fringe of the Warrior system, Harris had managed to get a few new pilots to replace those who had been lost. But those new pilots had no combat experience. Initial estimate is 100, Harris replied. Everyone, be ready to engage. Affirmative, the entire squadron replied in unison. Harris had been impatient waiting for his chance to engage the Rukpli. He had heard of the battles around Armstrong Station and now with these two Rukpli troop vessels. When Mendez had given the signal, he had been the first to strap into his fighter ship. Grayson, take the lead as we come around the UFS Winston, Harris ordered. Affirmative, Grayson replied. Harris brought his fighter ship behind Grayson's one as they reached the stern of the UFS Winston and went around it. He nearly gasped out at what his eyes witnessed. Several rows of drones were lined up in parallel to the UFS Winston. Each of the drones had a metal clamp stuck to the UFS Winston. They were all moving together. Harris had never seen anything like it. If someone had told him that such a thing was possible, he would have scoffed at that person. But witnessing it with his own eyes was a completely different experience. A distance away was the other larger Rukpli vessel. It was silently moving together with the drones. I think that's more than 100 drones, sir, Grayson muttered. His lieutenant was right. Glancing at the rows of drones, Harris counted at least 300 of them. Take them out, Harris barked. Be careful to avoid hitting the UFS Winston. His squadron began to disperse in different directions. Several of the fighter ships moved to the front of the UFS Winston and began firing at the drones. Incoming, Grayson shouted. Red alerts began wailing in Harris's cockpit controls. The Rukpli had unleashed their fighters. Chapter 23, Outside of Arcadia, Euphra. The weapons fire from the Rukpli shuttle was relentless. Faster, Korea yelled. Stanley was running as fast as he could. He didn't know how it was possible, but Korea had the ability to outrun a human easily. She didn't even seem to be breaking a sweat. It had to be another enhanced ability of the Rabinto species. He made a mental note to ask her about it later. He felt the heat of the weapons fire on his heels as he kept running. Stanley had forgotten about the Rukpli vessel that had been following him down to the planet's surface. When he had left his Rukpli vessel, his attention had been on solely finding Korea. Somehow the Rukpli vessel that had trailed him must have used their sensors to detect the two of them. By now Korea had reached the first hill and was waving to him. Stanley mustered in himself all that he could as he darted towards Korea's position. He dared not look back at the Rukpli vessel. Korea began firing her weapon into the air, but Stanley wasn't sure how effective that would be against a vessel. Once Stanley reached the first hill, he took cover behind some rocks. He was gasping for air and felt like his legs would give way. You need to run faster, Korea said calmly. Stanley kept looking at his feet, trying to gather his breath. He had never run so fast in his life. Aren't you tired? Stanley asked in between breaths. Tired of what? Stanley waved his hand at her and sat down on the ground behind the rocks. Korea eyed him. Don't tell me you're tired. That wasn't even a long run. Stanley glared at her. What the heck was she talking about? That had been the run of his life. He couldn't recall ever running so fast, not even during his academy days. Where's the vessel? Stanley asked as he stood back up and leaned against the rock. It withdrew when I started firing at it, Korea remarked. Stanley looked at her incredulously. Do you mean that during the last part of my run, there was no one chasing me? I thought you knew that, Korea smirked. But I think it was good for you to run. You humans don't seem to be so good at running. Compared to what, a Rabinto? Korea softened her face. I meant that you don't have the speed like we do. How can you run so fast? Stanley asked. Korea smiled. Our bodies are enhanced for speed. Stanley raised his hands in frustration. That makes sense? He had been right in his assumption. The Rabinto had enhanced abilities. Hearing was one, but now speed was another. Somehow, the Rabinto had conveniently forgotten to mention this when they had been at the fringe of the Warrior system. You seem angry, Korea mused. I'm not angry, just annoyed. I cannot tell the difference between the two. Stanley waved his hand and turned around to look at the sky. Korea was beginning to push his buttons, but he refused to get into an argument with her. Do you think the vessel will return? Stanley asked. Then weapons fire erupted from behind him. Stanley swirled around. The Rukpli shuttle was right in front of him. Chapter 24, Cockpit, UFS Fighter Ship. Lieutenant Grayson pulled back on her controls as a fighter ship narrowly avoided hitting a Rukpli fighter. Just like their last encounter, more and more Rukpli fighters were emerging from the second larger Rukpli vessel. She was glad to be back in the cockpit. Although she had enjoyed her time helping get Korea and the Rabinto species Acclimatized to the space station, this was where she belonged. It was also her first time flying again ever since she went down on the planet belonging to the Rabinto species. Her adrenaline was pumping through her body as she navigated her vessel. "I got 2 bogies on my tail," Harris shouted. Grayson banked her fighter ship towards Harris's vessel and locked on one of the Rukpli fighters. She then unleashed a torrent of weapons fire. The first Rukpli fighter exploded into a ball of flames. Grayson raised her fist. The second Rukpli fighter broke off Harris's tail and veered to the left. She was tempted to chase it but decided to let it go. "Thanks," Harris replied. Grayson switched to a private comms with Harris. "Sir, I don't think we can fend off the Rukpli fighters and destroy the drones all at the same time." She had sensed the Rukpli fighter ships were trying to draw them away from the UFS Winston. That would have been her strategy too if she had been in their vessels. "I know they're trying to draw us away," Harris replied, "but we need to bring them back into the UFS Winston. Our goal is to slow down the UFS Winston." Grayson checked her sensor data. They had only managed to destroy about 30 drones. That wasn't enough. At this rate, they wouldn't be able to destroy enough drones to slow down the UFS Winston. "Any word on the UFS Winston?" Grayson asked as she found a new target and fired her weapons. "So far, nothing," Harris replied. He then opened a comms to the entire squadron. "Everyone, stay closer to the UFS Winston." Then an alert popped up on her controls. It was a comms from Commander Mendez. "Grayson, I need you to disengage," Mendez ordered. "I have a special mission for you. Stanley and Corey are on the planet's surface, but I think they're in trouble." "Affirmative," Grayson replied as she listened to what Mendez shared. At the end of the comms, Harris's voice came through. "Go now, we'll make an opening for you." Harris must have been listening in on the comms from Mendez. Grayson was a bit disappointed that she had to leave her squadron, but Captain Stanley's life was in danger. She knew Mendez wouldn't have picked her for the special mission if it wasn't serious. "Keep at it," Grayson said as she veered off into space and towards Euphra. Mendez had transmitted to her the last known position of Stanley's Rukpli shuttle. Apparently, he had been chasing another Rukpli shuttle that had taken Korea. Grayson didn't expect anything less from Stanley. She just hoped she would be in time to help him. Chapter 25, Cockpit UFS Fighter Ship. Harris eyed the drones moving the UFS Winston. By now, more than 50 of them had been destroyed by his squadron, but it had been a slow process, especially since they had to evade and attack the incoming Rukpli fighter ships. Mendez came on his private comms. "Harris, report." "Commander, it's a slow process," Harris replied. "We don't have much time left," Mendez remarked. "They are nearly on the verge of reaching orbit." Harris knew the gravity of the situation. The Rukpli fighter vessels were no longer interested in shooting them down. It was obvious their instructions were to keep his squadron busy. That was a much easier objective for the Rukpli fighter ships to achieve. Harris had to admit that it was an effective strategy. "We need more fighters," Harris admitted, exasperation dripping from his voice. His fighter ship kept firing shot after shot as his console confirmed the new target. Fortunately, most of the Rukpli targets were destroyed by one hit, but their numbers didn't seem to be diminishing. "Which we don't have," Mendez said. "Has there been any update from the UFS Winston?" "Negative." Harris sensed a tinge of hopelessness in Mendez's tone. The commander was also up against a corner. Harris couldn't understand why the UFS Winston couldn't get their act together. Surely the engineering department must be able to restore power. If that happened, they could easily get their weapons online and fire on those drones. That would put an immediate stop to all movement. Then Harris gasped. "What is it?" Mendez asked. One of the larger drones at the stern of the UFS Winston had exploded, but the explosion hadn't been caused by one of his fighter ships. Instead, it appeared that the drone had moved closer to the hull of the UFS Winston and self-ignited. "I see it," Mendez said. "We send word for the UFS Winston to evacuate now." Another larger drone exploded. There was a breach in that part of the hull, and another larger drone blew up in a ball of flames. "They need to move quickly," Harris said. "Get your squadron out of there now," Mendez barked. "Affirmative." Harris opened a comms to his squadron. "Pull away from the UFS Winston and the drones." None of them replied to him, but he didn't need to worry. His sensors indicated his squadron breaking away from the vicinity of space beside the UFS Winston. As Harris swerved his fighter ship away from the UFS Winston, a ripple of explosions began emerging along its hull. He could only hope the crew had been able to get to the escape pods in time. Then a large set of explosions emerged around the hull, and a series of explosions ripped through the UFS Winston as it broke into pieces. A light from the explosion blinded him momentarily. His fighter ship began to swerve away from the ripples caused by the explosion, and then the UFS Winston was gone. Harris checked his sensors, but he couldn't detect any escape pods. His blood ran cold. An entire UFS destroyer and its crew were gone. Chapter 26, Outside of Arcadia, Euphra. Stanley kept his hands in the air following Korea. The Rukpli shuttle in front of them had landed. The Rukpli alien seated at the console was clear. Stanley didn't want to risk doing anything, but his mind was at work trying to find a way out of the situation. Would the Rukpli kill them both or take them prisoner? He didn't know. That uncertainty began to eat at him. A different Rukpli alien emerged from behind the shuttle. It had a weapon aimed at them. The Rukpli alien stopped a few meters from them and beckoned them to come closer. Move this way, the Rukpli alien sneered. Stanley was surprised that the Rukpli alien didn't immediately kill them. What was going on here? He obeyed the command and shuffled forward with Korea right behind him. Once the Rukpli alien was behind them, it nudged them forward. Do not try anything, human, the Rukpli alien scowled. Then a barrage of weapons fire erupted from behind them. Stanley jumped and rolled to one side. He didn't know what was happening, but only knew that the weapons fire had come from above. This way, Korea murmured. It was only then Stanley realized that the female Robinto was beside him and motioning for them to crawl away. The Rukpli alien who had been following them was on the ground. It was apparently dead. As they crawled away, the Rukpli vessel began to lift off the surface. We need to find cover, Korea said. Stanley didn't need to be told twice what would happen if they didn't find cover. Dust began to swirl around as the Rukpli vessel ascended. Then an explosion ripped through the vessel and it turned into a ball of flames. Wreckage from the Rukpli vessel began falling around as Stanley jumped away. He then looked up into the sky. Stanley pointed into the sky. It's one of our fighter ships. Are you sure? Korea asked nervously. It's Grayson. I can see her face. Stanley stood still as Lieutenant Grayson landed her fighter ship nearby. She then jumped out of her vessel and ran up to them. I have never been so glad to see you, Stanley smiled. What are you doing here? Korea asked. Mendez sent me on a special mission to find the both of you, Grayson replied. By the looks of it, I was just in time. Stanley didn't want to ask how Mendez had found out about his latest solo venture. He was certain Mendez would have been furious with Diaz for letting him go. However, Mendez, with his deep experience, had done the right thing. Your timing was better than perfect, Stanley said, and high-fived Grayson. Korea folded her arms and looked at them. You humans are strange. Stanley laughed out loud. It's a human thing. Korea frowned. I can see that. Captain, we need to get back to Arcadia, Grayson said. Stanley pointed out. We all cannot get into your fighter ship. What do you propose? I sent a request for UFS to send the shuttle out here, Grayson replied. We'll wait here until it arrives. Any news on what's happening up there? Stanley asked. Grayson pursed her lips. It isn't good. Stanley sensed Grayson was holding back information. Tell us what's going on. As Grayson shared, Stanley's eyes widened. Grayson hadn't been wrong. The situation in orbit was deteriorating fast. He needed to get back up there soon. He began to question whether he had made the right decision leaving Armstrong Station. Diaz had insisted she needed his help. Now it appeared that things had gone out of control in orbit. Korea pointed into the sky. Is that a vessel? Stanley sighed. A Rukpli vessel was descending through the atmosphere. One of the Rukpli vessels had broken through the UFS blockade. Chapter 27, UFS Underground Bunker, Arcadia. Admiral Sheldon stared at Mendez's face. What do you mean the UFS Winston is gone? He couldn't believe what Commander Mendez had just reported. It had to be a mistake. Mendez must have made a mistake. There was no way one of their newest destroyers could have been blown apart. Sir, we lost the entire ship, Mendez replied. It was being dragged by the Rukpli drones and exploded. I watched it happen with my own eyes. There was nothing we could do. You're talking about hundreds of UFS personnel, Sheldon admitted. Mendez nodded reluctantly. What's the status in orbit? Sheldon asked. That's why I'm here, Mendez said. One of the Rukpli troop vessels broke through our blockade. It's on its way to the surface. The news kept getting worse. Losing the UFS Winston was a disaster, but breaching of the orbital blockade was unacceptable. Are you able to intercept and destroy it? Sheldon inquired. Negative, Mendez replied. We're still fighting with the other Rukpli troop vessel. Sheldon grimaced. Things were falling apart faster than he had expected. The Rukpli had been strategic in their point of attack on Euphra, and now they had achieved a degree of success. The Rukpli troop vessel would shift the battle onto the surface. Continue to engage the Rukpli in orbit, Sheldon ordered. Ensure that no more vessels breach the blockade. Do whatever you can. One troop vessel was on the way to the surface was enough. He didn't need any more costly mistakes up there in orbit. Yes, sir, Mendez said. One more thing. Where's Captain Stanley? Sheldon asked. Mendez hesitated. That was more than enough for Sheldon to know that Stanley was doing something he shouldn't be doing. The last I heard was that he was fighting the Rukpli on Armstrong Station, Mendez replied calmly. Sheldon nodded and the comms ended with Mendez. It wasn't that he didn't trust Commander Mendes. Mendes was more than capable of leading the UFS Intrepid, but a vessel needed its captain. If Stanley had been in command, maybe the breach could have been avoided. It was too late speculating on what could have been done. Now he had to face the reality of a ground assault on Euphra. He opened a holoscreen with General Williams. General, one large Rukpli troop vessel is on the way to the surface. That mere statement did nothing but demonstrate the incompetence of the UFS and its leadership. Sheldon hated it. Then, it has begun, Williams said. I'll inform Peters. Chapter 28, Southern Perimeter Arcadia. Peters stood above the trench and looked up into the sky. His men were lined up with their weapons along the trench in front of him. When he had got word from General Williams, he had been glad that all the trenches surrounding this part of Arcadia had been completed. All his men had been injected with the serum. Today they were going to find out whether it would work or not against the Rukpli. As an added precaution, all his soldiers were wearing the Trebium armor. While he had faith in Humphreys, he couldn't risk it with his soldiers. The approaching Rukpli vessel was halfway to the surface. It was a big vessel. Peters couldn't even imagine how many Rukpli were inside that vessel. Would his soldiers be enough to fight them off? He didn't know, but they would die trying. All the civilians had finished moving to the underground bunkers north of Arcadia. Hopefully that would keep them safe. It was too dangerous to move anyone off the planet, especially after the disappearance of the UFS Trident. No one knew the Rukpli aliens' endgame. He opened the comms to Lieutenant Cruz. The ground assault is about to begin. Are you in place? Yes, Captain, Cruz replied. We reached the Trebium mine and positioned ourselves around it. Cruz and her men and women had to defend the Trebium mine. Peters knew it was only a matter of time before the Rukpli went after the Trebium mine again. He closed the comms and stared ahead. Captain, we got incoming vessels, Lieutenant, Wilder shouted. The Rukpli had decided to send a few shuttles before their vessel reached the surface. That was an odd decision. Maybe they were intending for the initial shuttles to clear the way for the larger troop vessel. The Rukpli shuttles began to descend at an alarming speed. Everyone, hold your fire until I say so, Peters shouted. How do you know they will come to us? Wilder asked. Peters pointed ahead. Because of that. The container with the Rukpli prisoner was about 200 meters ahead of his position. He had placed it there for a purpose. The Rukpli prisoner was bait. The only question left was whether the Rukpli aliens would take the bait. Based on everything he had learned of the Rukpli, he sensed they wouldn't want to leave one of their own trapped out in the open. Right before the shuttles reached the surface, explosions began to rip 500 meters ahead of his position. The larger Rukpli vessel had begun to bombard the ground. Peters felt the ground shake as a series of explosions shattered the silence before the start of the battle. As quick as it had started, the bombardment stopped. Whirlwinds of dust swarmed the entire area ahead of them. Peters lost track of the shuttles. That had been the intention of the bombardment. Keep your eyes open for the shuttles, Peters ordered. They're landing, Wilder muttered. The Rukpli shuttles were hovering over the ground while their exhaust kicked up a storm of dust. The hatches opened and the first Rukpli aliens emerged. Peters had expected it. The Rukpli emerging out of the shuttles had the back-mounted weapons. Peters turned to Wilder, prepared to activate the shield. With that, he jumped into the trenches, and he was just in time as the first explosions erupted right in front of him. Chapter 29, Southern Perimeter Arcadia. Report, Peters shouted as the explosions kept erupting around them. Those back-mounted weapons on the Rukpli kept hitting the ground before the trenches. Peters could smell the fear on his soldiers. Many of them around him were much younger. They had never experienced a ground assault in their lives. He suspected most of them had been born on Euphra. No matter how much training was done, there was no equivalent to the experience on the battlefield. Soon he would find out how many of them were ready for the hard life of serving in the military. Soldiers, mind your positions, Peters barked. All the men and women around him nodded their heads in unison. Peters opened the comms to Lieutenant Wilder. Wilder, are you ready? Yes, Captain, Wilder replied in a shaky voice. Peters peered out of the trenches. The shuttles had disappeared. What was left was a wall of Rukpli aliens approaching them. Every one of the Rukpli aliens had back-mounted weapons. To the casual observer, it would be terrifying. But Peters knew of their capabilities. He wasn't going to stand down. If the Rukpli wanted a full-scale attack, so be it. The Rukpli were slowly moving forward. They didn't look at all scared. From his estimation, it looked like at least 10 aliens had stepped off each shuttle. That alone was a formidable force. The explosions had stopped. Peters frowned as he observed the Rukpli aliens sweeping their heads for potential threats. He was certain the Rukpli aliens had spotted the trenches they had dug. There was no way they could have missed it. Peters took out his rifle blaster, aimed it at one of the Rukpli aliens in the center, targeted its back-mounted weapons and fired. The back-mounted weapons exploded in a ball of flames, bringing down the Rukpli with it. Peters ducked as another round of explosions ripped behind the trench. "Captain, they are charging," Wilder announced. Peters smiled. The Rukpli aliens were doing what he had expected. He peered out again. They were moving at an astounding speed. 5 seconds. 3, 2, 1. "Activate the emitter shield now," Peters hollered. "Yes, sir," Wilder replied. There was a whir as a long emitter shield got activated 100 meters beyond their trenches. Peters had gotten his engineers to work day and night to create a large enough emitter shield to protect the trenches. He had thought the engineers wouldn't be able to deliver it on time, but they had done the impossible. They had also rerouted a lot of power from this part of Arcadia to support the emitter shield. The blood-curdling sounds of the Rukpli aliens filled the air. They had never expected the emitter shield. "Fire on my command," Peters ordered. More screams could be heard. He peered out again. Most of the Rukpli aliens had stopped in their tracks. A few were on their knees. "Fire now," Peters shouted. All the soldiers around him stood, shouldered their rifle blasters, and let loose multiple bursts of weapons fire. The sound was deafening. Many of their weapons fire found their targets. Unfortunately, some of the soldiers were firing in too many directions. "Target one Rukpli alien at a time," Peters barked. This round, their weapons fire was more targeted and effective. Multiple Rukpli aliens had collapsed on the ground. They were dead. "More incoming shuttles," Wilder announced. Peters gritted his teeth. The same shuttles were again descending rapidly. They must have returned to reload with another contingent of Rukpli. He had to admit that the Rukpli were a determined enemy. They didn't care how many casualties they suffered. Chapter 30, Southern Perimeter Arcadia. The initial wall of the Rukpli aliens had collapsed. The emitter shield had done its job, but Peters knew he wouldn't be able to hold the line. The second group of Rukpli aliens had already stepped off the shuttles, and they had begun to approach the trenches. However, the Rukpli aliens were taking a more cautious approach. They began to cluster into smaller groups. Peters frowned. The Rukpli aliens were adapting in face of the previous failure. "Fire the mortars now," Peters ordered. The soldiers behind him began loading the mortars and let them loose. The mortar shells went over his head and fell ahead of the marching Rukpli aliens. The explosions were deafening. A few Rukpli were thrown into the air. Others jumped away and managed to avoid the mortar shells. The Rukpli aliens dispersed and regrouped quickly. This time they grouped in even smaller formations as they continued to advance. The mortar shells kept flying through the air, but as time went by, their effectiveness began to drop. Peters knew they weren't going to be able to hold the trench much longer. He turned to the soldiers. "Everyone fall back to the next line of defense, now." The young men and women around him began leaving the trenches and heading into the city, while more mortar shells flew over their heads and into the path of the oncoming Rukpli aliens. Then the emitter shield began flickering and shut down. "A Rukpli shuttle destroyed the emitter shield," Wilder announced. The Rukpli aliens must have spotted the source of the emitters. It was inevitable, but Peters hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Inform UFS that we need air cover immediately," Peters said, as he left the empty trenches and made his way back into the city. "Yes, sir," Wilder said. Peters had never expected to hold the trenches. Instead, he had hoped it would slow the Rukpli aliens down. To some extent that had happened, but it wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. The Rukpli aliens were relentless. He passed those soldiers firing the mortar shells and warned them to retreat. His soldiers would make their next stand at the next line of defense. Peters broke into a run and stopped behind a defensive wall that had been constructed with prefab blocks of rock. Peters glanced around the defensive wall. The soldiers who had been with him in the trenches were all here. They had taken up positions in between the rocks to fire on the Rukpli aliens. He glanced over the defensive wall. The Rukpli aliens were crossing the trenches. They remained in small formations as they entered the perimeter of Arcadia. Soon they would walk in between a few buildings. The container holding the Rukpli prisoner had been dismantled. It didn't matter any longer. The container had served its purpose in drawing the enemy. "Enemy approaching the buildings," Wilder reported. "Copy that," Peter said. "Wait for my signal." He observed the Rukpli aliens starting to move a bit faster as they marched between the buildings. Several of them kept glancing around, but none of the Rukpli aliens fired their weapons, which Peters found unusual. "Detonate," Peters ordered. A series of explosions ripped across the buildings. The mines that had been planted along the passageways between the buildings exploded in unison. Huge balls of flame shot out and up to the sky. The buildings around those passageways stood briefly before crumbling apart. The impact on those Rukpli aliens was immense. Blocks of prefab slammed into the Rukpli aliens, trapping those who found themselves in between the buildings. The timing was perfect. Bodies of Rukpli aliens went flying in all directions. A few of the soldiers with him raised their fists in victory. It was presumptuous. This was only the second wave of the Rukpli onslaught. Peters had no estimation how many waves would come forth. He looked at the sky. The large Rukpli vessel was still hovering halfway through the atmosphere, and more shuttles were on the way, bringing more Rukpli troops. Peters suppressed a sigh. "Where's the air cover?" Peters demanded. "On the way, sir," Wilder replied. On the way was an insufficient response. The Rukpli would adapt quickly. Again, they needed to be faster than the aliens. "Captain, those aren't shuttles," Wilder said. "They're Rukpli fighters." Peters shook his head in dismay. The Rukpli aliens had figured it out. They weren't going to let any more of their troops walk into traps. Instead, they had sent their fighter vessels. Chapter 31, Sudden Perimeter Arcadia. "Incoming," Peters shouted as he ducked. "Everyone get down." Explosions began to erupt all around the defensive wall. The ground continued to vibrate for a few seconds. Then there was silence. Peters looked up. The first wave of the Rukpli fighter ships' bombings had passed, but that was only the first wave. More would be on the way. Peters opened the comms to Wilder. "Get people into the buildings behind us. Move them to the higher levels and target the fighter ships as they come around." "Yes, Captain," Wilder replied. Peters motioned to a group of 10 soldiers. "You stay here and man this defensive wall. I want the rest of you to get into the higher levels in the buildings behind us. When those fighter ships arrive, fire on them with everything you got." The soldiers nodded and began moving swiftly. The victorious looks on their faces had been replaced by anxiety. An incoming comms opened. "Captain Peters, this is Harris. Our squadron is on the way down from orbit." It was about time. What had taken them so long? Peters struggled to control himself. This wasn't the time to unload on the squadron leader. He recognized the name. It was from Captain Stanley's vessel. "We're under enemy attack," Peters reported. "What's your ETA?" "A few minutes," Harris replied, and the comms ended. Peters frowned as he looked ahead. Another wave of Rukpli fighter ships was approaching them. This time they had got into formation, in groups of 2 or 3. Peters grimaced. The Rukpli must have identified several key installations to target during the next wave. Where he was standing had to be one of those installations. He motioned to the soldiers left with him. "2 of you pick one of those fighter ships and target them. Wait for my signal." He counted down the seconds. As the Rukpli fighter ships got closer, "Fire," Peters snapped. The soldiers unleashed a torrent of weapons fire. Streaks of plasma fire screamed ahead at the incoming Rukpli fighter ships. Some completely missed their targets, but a few made contact with the wings of several Rukpli fighters, which burst into flames and crashed onto the ground. "Duck," Peters ordered as more explosions landed in front of the defensive wall. This time it was louder than before. There were already breaches in the defensive wall. It wasn't going to be able to survive another round of vicious assault. Where were Harris and the squadron? One of the young soldiers turned to him. "Now what, sir?" Peters frowned. "Fall back into the buildings." He had to admit it was pointless to try and hold the defensive wall. The soldiers began retreating to the buildings behind them. Peters joined them as they rushed into the nearest building. He stood inside the door and watched. The Rukpli fighter ships were coming around again. They were about a minute away. "Everyone get into position," Peters hollered. "Choose your targets carefully." He opened the comms to Wilder. "Are the men and women ready?" There was no reply. Silence greeted him. Peters could only assume the worst. Lieutenant Wilder was dead. The Rukpli fighter ships were 20 seconds away. Then streaks of blue light flashed towards the Rukpli fighter ships. One by one, each of the Rukpli fighter ships burst into a ball of flames. Harris and his squadron had made it. However, in the distance, another wave of Rukpli fighter ships emerged. Chapter 32, Cockpit Euphra's fighter ship. "Keep taking them out," Harris shouted as he unleashed more weapons fire. The entire group of Rukpli fighter ships that had been on the verge of attacking the southern part of Arcadia had been destroyed. He had been surprised by the ease with which his squadron had destroyed the Rukpli fighter ships. Something wasn't right. Why hadn't the Rukpli vessels broken formation? "Sir, all of them have been destroyed," Lieutenant Jones reported. "Nice work," Harris said. "More incoming," Jones exclaimed. Alerts began to wail out of Harris's cockpit controls. A group of red icons appeared on his console. Harris gritted his teeth. The previous group of Rukpli fighter ships had been the sacrifice, just like when they had fought at the fringe of the Vonnier system. No wonder it had been so easy to destroy them. "Draw them away from Arcadia," Harris ordered. An alert popped up. He had a Rukpli fighter on his tail. Harris pushed the controls to the left as his fighter ship banked in that direction. The Rukpli fighter was still on his tail. He pulled back on the controls as he ascended rapidly. At that moment, the larger Rukpli vessel came into his view. He gasped. More Rukpli fighters were streaming out of that vessel. He counted hundreds of them. There was no way his squadron was going to be able to fend them off. The entire UFS didn't have the air capability to match the Rukpli fighter ships. He opened the comms to Captain Peters. Captain, we got confirmation that hundreds of fighters are being launched from a single Rukpli vessel. Hundreds? Peters asked. Yes, sir, Harris replied. Try your best to keep them occupied, Peters said, and closed the comms. Harris had to assume Peters knew they wouldn't be able to stop them. He didn't know what the alternative was. There was none. It would only be a matter of time before his squadron was overwhelmed. He received a transmission that the remaining squadrons from Titanic Base had launched. That would help at least for now, but it wasn't a sustainable solution against the Rukpli aliens. Harris shot down 2 more Rukpli fighters as he navigated his vessel towards the mountains along the southern perimeter of Arcadia. On his tail were 5 enemy fighters. Harris didn't miss a beat as his vessel swerved in and around the mountains. Red alerts began to wail out again as the Rukpli fighters targeted his vessel. Then 2 explosions erupted behind him. There were only 3 red icons on his console. Another explosion erupted. 2 red icons left. What was going on? The 2 red icons dropped off his tail. A voice came through his comms. Sir, are you okay? It was Lieutenant Grayson. Where did you come from? Harris shouted in delight. It doesn't matter, Grayson said. It seems I was right on time. Harris smiled. Nice shooting, Lieutenant. I had some help, Grayson reported. A shuttle appeared on his starboard side. Harris turned his head. His eyes widened. Captain Stanley was at the controls of the shuttle. Stanley gestured to him. Did you think we were going to let you die? Grayson asked. We need to get back to the fight, Harris said. Yes, sir, Grayson replied. Stanley will be heading to the Trebium mine. I'll escort you back. Escort me? Harris grunted. He could imagine Grayson laughing in a fighter ship. Despite that, he was glad they had emerged out of nowhere. The shuttle turned away as he and Grayson headed back towards the southern perimeter of Arcadia. Chapter 33, Southern Quadrants, Arcadia. Peters sidestepped the fallen bodies of his soldiers. They were everywhere. His mind couldn't even comprehend what his eyes were witnessing. Young men and women who had fought valiantly in their first battle. But none of them would live to tell the story to their children or their families. Blood was splattered everywhere, body parts strewn across the ground. The Rukpli fighter ships had been merciless. There had been a sudden surge of them in the hundreds. They had targeted the buildings near the abandoned defensive wall. It had been nothing short of a massacre. The Rukpli fighter ships hadn't stopped firing until nearly every building had collapsed on itself, trapping those soldiers inside and ensuring their deaths. Peters had recognized the tactics of the enemy and warned his men and women to jump out of the buildings. But it had been too late. His command had been drowned out by the relentless weapons fired by the Rukpli. Eventually he had jumped out at the very last minute before the building he had been in had crumbled on itself. Peters touched a cut on his face. The bleeding had stopped. His body was bruised when he had hit the ground. He looked up into the sky. The larger Rukpli troop vessel was still holding its position. It was the source of the massacre. Following the collapse of the buildings, the Rukpli fighter ships had withdrawn. Lieutenant Crew's voice came over the comms. Captain, Captain. She must have heard of the devastation on the battlefield. Yes, Lieutenant, Peters whispered. He took no joy in being one of the few left alive in the southern quadrants of Arcadia. He had failed these young men and women. They had trusted him and his attack plan, but it had led them to death. He had led them to death. He continued to struggle with the stench of death swirling all around him. There was a sigh of relief in Cruz's voice. Reports came in of the collapse of the defensive wall and the buildings surrounding it. Lieutenant, ensure you hold the Trebium mine, Peters said, and closed the comms. He wasn't in the frame of mind to talk to his lieutenant. Not now. He continued to survey the dead bodies. Was this what his father had encountered? The wars on Earth had been greater and more devastating, but Peters felt he got a glimpse into that horror today. Thinking of his father made Peters emotional. He struggled to control himself. This wasn't the time to give in to his emotions. The war wasn't over. The enemy was still up there, planning their next move. In the chaos, he hadn't been able to identify where the Rukpli fighter ships had withdrawn to. He didn't think they had returned into that larger Rukpli vessel. Those Rukpli fighter ships were somewhere out there. Another comms opened. It was Harris. Captain, I don't know, Harris muttered. Harris must have been able to witness the devastation from the air. Peters was relieved not to share in that view. He needed to stay focused, now more than ever. People were depending on him. He would not give the Rukpli the satisfaction of victory. Harris, get the squadrons to keep circling Arcadia, Peters ordered. The war isn't over. Yes, Captain, Harris replied. Although the squadron hadn't been able to stop the onslaught, Peters needed them to run interference on any Rukpli vessels. What about the Trebium mine, Harris asked. Do you want me to send additional fighters over there? Negative, Peters said. Keep your people on Arcadia. Peters couldn't afford to send anyone to the Trebium mine. Crews would have to defend the position with the units under her charge. Peters gathered himself together and left the vicinity of the dead bodies. He needed to regroup and prepare for the next wave of Rukpli attacks. It was going to come soon. The Rukpli aliens weren't the ones to wait. They would strike while the opportunity was there. Chapter 34, Underground Command Center north of Arcadia. General Williams turned to his officer. What's the latest status from Arcadia? We lost the defensive wall, the officer replied. The southern quadrants have suffered mass deaths. I haven't got the number of casualties yet. Williams frowned. The number of casualties would be immaterial at this point. He didn't even know if Captain Peters was among the dead. Communications had been wiped out when the bombing runs by the Rukpli fighter ships had begun. There was no way to communicate with any survivors in that part of the city. When can we get communication up and running? Williams asked. No one answered. He looked around the underground command center. There were 5 officers with him. Williams began to lose his patience. Does anyone have an answer? I need to get the communications up now. General, we're attempting to get it up, one of the officers replied. How long will it take, soldier? Williams barked. Another hour, the officer replied. Williams felt like he was about to explode. They didn't have the luxury of another hour. They didn't even have another 15 minutes. He had gotten word that the Rukpli troop vessel was still in a holding pattern above the southern quadrants of Arcadia. There was no telling what the Rukpli aliens were planning next. General, our citywide sensors indicate that a group of Rukpli fighter ships are heading towards the Trebium mine, the officer reported. Send a transmission to Lieutenant Cruz and her units, Williams ordered. Yes, sir, the officer replied. Do we know if these fighter ships are able to detect this position, Williams inquired. Negative, the officer replied. So far, we haven't detected anything near this bunker. Williams didn't know how long that would last. The Rukpli aliens had a way of discovering their movements. He took a few steps to the rear of the bunker and opened the comms with Admiral Sheldon. Sheldon, what's your status? Williams asked. The squadrons are patrolling around Arcadia, Sheldon replied. That's good, Williams said. It was Peters' idea, Sheldon added. Williams exhaled a sigh of relief. Peters was still alive. It was incredible that he had made it out alive from that onslaught. Peters' survival reminded Williams of General Myers, who had remarkably been able to walk away from large-scale assaults back on Earth, and it had happened on multiple occasions. It looked like Myers' son was walking in his footsteps. There's something else, Sheldon announced. Commander Diaz managed to intercept a transmission from the Rukpli. Williams raised his eyebrows. Intercept? That's our current thinking, Sheldon replied. It may have been sent to the Rukpli troop vessel in Euphra's atmosphere. The transmission indicated that they needed to secure the mineral and put it as their highest priority. They are short of the Trebium, but why? If you recall, one of Stanley's reports during his encounter on the Robinto homeworld indicated that the Rukpli also consume the Trebium and it gives them strength. Williams couldn't remember it, but the implication was astounding. Could that be why they sent only so few troop ships? And that is why there's a sudden halt to the ground assault? My thoughts exactly, Sheldon confirmed. It means the Rukpli are going to go after the Trebium mine, Williams said. Can you get more vessels out there? We're trying to do that now. We also need to protect Arcadia. Our resources are too thin. We lost many fighters. Williams realized they were in a corner. Had that been the intention of the Rukpli aliens all along? To scuttle their resources until they couldn't defend anything? He was beginning to think so. Chapter 35, Trebium Mine outside of Tomb. Lieutenant Cruz walked up to one of the soldiers watching the perimeter. Report. Nothing yet, sir, the soldier replied. She had placed units at the front section and the rear exterior section of the mountain housing the Trebium mine. The Rukpli aliens could come from anywhere in any direction. What about the sensors? Cruz asked. Surprisingly, nothing. Keep scanning. The Rukpli fighters are out there. How can you be so sure? It's a feeling, Cruz countered. She was certain the Rukpli were plotting their next move. They wouldn't simply come in directly and attack the Trebium mine. That would be too obvious. Then a loud explosion erupted. It was coming from behind the Trebium mine. Watch the perimeter, Cruz shouted as she raced with 2 soldiers to the rear section. The moment she reached the rear section, she witnessed the horror. Soldiers' bodies were being thrown up in the air. Crews took cover behind some boulders. 2 Rukpli fighter ships had landed and 2 Rukpli aliens had stepped out of them. 5 more Rukpli fighter ships were hovering in the air and unleashing their weapons fire. Crews grimaced. Her soldiers didn't have a chance. Their weapons fire kept picking them off one by one. Crews motioned for her 2 soldiers. Both of you go and get a few mortars now. The 2 soldiers raced off while Crews turned her attention back to the attack. She shouldered her weapon and fired at the 2 Rukpli aliens on the ground, but it had no effect. The 2 Rukpli aliens on the ground were taking cover behind their vessels. Fall back, Crews waved at her soldiers. A few of the soldiers heard her and began to fall back. However, her shout caused the Rukpli aliens to turn their attention in her direction. Crews ducked as weapons fire roared over the boulders. She knew she couldn't stay here too long. Then a Rukpli fighter ship appeared above her. Crews realized she was pinned down. There was no escape. The Rukpli fighter ship waited. Crews aimed her weapon at it and kept firing. Then the Rukpli fighter ship exploded into a ball of flames. Crews frowned. That wasn't from her weapons fire. A UFS shuttle appeared out of nowhere. Crews exhaled a sigh of relief. She looked at the shuttle. It was Stanley and someone else that she didn't recognize. The shuttle turned towards the other Rukpli fighter vessels and began firing its weapons. Crews turned around. The appearance of the shuttle had caught the Rukpli fighter ships by surprise. They began to withdraw. However, the 2 Rukpli aliens on the ground were standing firm. By now, the remaining soldiers had gathered around. One soldier turned to her. Lieutenant, what are your orders? Take out those 2 aliens now, Crews ordered. She then waved at the shuttle and pointed in the direction of 2 Rukpli aliens. Stanley must have understood her intentions because the shuttle moved past them and fired on the 2 Rukpli aliens on the ground. In a matter of seconds, both Rukpli fighter vessels blew up, taking with them the 2 Rukpli aliens. Crews wiped the sweat off her face. They had managed to stop the breach, at least for now. Then she heard shouting from the front of the Trebium mine. Crews broke into a run. When she reached the front part of the mine, she stopped in shock. The dead bodies of soldiers were scattered around the entrance. Chapter 36, Southern Quadrants, Arcadia. Peters' mind continued to race over the images of the dead bodies. In that time, he had found a few signs of life. So far, he had encountered another 10 to 15 soldiers who had miraculously survived the destruction of the buildings, just like him. All of them were in a state of shock. They must have been wondering why they were spared. It was also their first time witnessing carnage at such a scale. This would be a scar on their lives. Peters doubted any of those soldiers would ever forget this massacre. It would haunt them and him for years to come. That was assuming they lived to tell the story. If they lived, this day would go down as one that Euphra would always remember. One of the soldiers rushed up to him. Sir, we spotted shuttles descending from that Rukpli vessel. Peters gazed into the sky. The soldier was correct. The shuttles were returning. Were they coming to kill the remaining survivors? He wasn't sure. Arm yourselves and get in position, Peters ordered. Spread out. Do not congregate together. Yes, sir, the soldier said and left. If the Rukpli shuttles were coming for another round, the chances of survival were minimal. Those Rukpli shuttles would be able to pick off each of his soldiers. Then Peters narrowed his eyes. The trajectory of the Rukpli shuttles indicated they were descending onto the planet's surface and not heading over to his position. What were the Rukpli up to now? The shuttles touched down on the surface. Peters held his breath. Was this a new tactic by the Rukpli? Then Rukpli aliens began pouring out of the shuttles. It wasn't like the last 2 groups. There were many more Rukpli aliens, hundreds of them. However, these didn't have back-mounted weapons. They appeared to be mere Rukpli troops. That was a small victory. Stand ready, Peters shouted to the small group of soldiers. He and his small group of soldiers would need to repel the latest attack wave. At last count, he had 20 soldiers. 20 soldiers against hundreds of Rukpli troops. The odds were against him in every respect, but Peters refused to give up. He was going to fight until his last dying breath. He intended to ensure the Rukpli remembered humanity as a force that never gave up. Then a sound pierced the area he was standing on. It was a shrill one. Peters' eyes swept the incoming Rukpli aliens. The sound wasn't coming from their direction. The sound emerged again. It sounded vaguely familiar. Peters heard a noise behind him. He swirled around ready to fire. A lone figure stood smirking at him. It was his uncle. Irvine raised his hands. Hold on there. Do not shoot. It's just us. Peters looked confused. What was his uncle doing here? How had he gotten to the southern quadrants? Shouldn't his uncle be in the underground bunkers? You shouldn't be out here, Peters commented. Neither should you, Irvine retorted. Peters hated talking to his uncle. Why did his uncle have to be like that? I'm in operational command. Peters' voice trailed off. Irvine pointed at the ground. Of a dead army. Peters raised his fist. His heart was pounding. How dare his uncle talk like that about his men and women? All those soldiers had willingly sacrificed their lives for Euphra. His uncle hadn't done anything sacrificial. Instead, he hid out on the settlements. His uncle must have sensed his anger. Look, I didn't mean to upset you. Sometimes there are things I know I shouldn't say, but I end up letting my big mouth say it. Sometimes? That was an understatement. His uncle still hadn't explained what he was doing out here in the southern quadrants of Arcadia. We are here to help, Irvine announced. Your few settlers aren't going to make a difference, Peters highlighted. I don't have time to debate this with you. The best thing is for you and your settlers to get away from here. He kept one eye on the approaching Rukpli aliens. They were still a distance away, but he didn't have time for a long conversation with his uncle. That's where you're mistaken, Irvine said, and whistled. Peter's eyes widened as hundreds of men appeared out of nowhere. This is my army, Irvine said, and we are here to help you. You don't have any weapons, Peters insisted. Irvine pointed to those weapons lying everywhere on the ground. We will use these ones, or at least the ones that are working. Peters nodded reluctantly. His uncle turned around and started giving out orders. The hundreds of men jumped into action. Peters had never seen anything like it before in his life. The settlers dispersed, picked up weapons, checked them, and got into position. Peters was still uncomfortable allowing civilians to fight with them. These men may die today. They know that and are willing to sacrifice for their land, Irvine said. This is their land. They do not want to hide and wait like cowards until the end. Let them defend their land. Defend it and die, Peters scoffed. You have much to learn from your father, Irvine advised. Peters raised his voice. Don't talk to me about him. You lost that right when you left us. Irvine took a step back. All right, have it your way. Peters noticed that most of the settlers appeared calm and proficient with the use of weapons. Where did they learn to use weapons? There are lots of things I want to tell you, but now is not the time, Irvine smiled. We have a war to win. His uncle's confidence never took a break. Irvine seemed to be too sure his men could handle the aliens, but they hadn't ever encountered the Rukpli. What were they thinking they could accomplish? Okay, Peters said. Ask them to get into position and target those Rukpli. They should pick their targets and stick to them. Wait for my command to commence shooting. He didn't have much faith in his uncle and the settlers. This was a ragtag army of people who foolishly thought they could defeat an organized alien force. Yes, Captain. Irvine smirked and disappeared. Peters hadn't come to terms with what he was asking the settlers to do. They were operating like a militia. The reality was that he needed military-trained bodies. Most of those who had been with him were dead. Maybe there was a chance to resist the enemy. He gazed back at the approaching Rukpli aliens. This was going to be the final stand out here in the southern quadrants. Chapter 37, Rukpli Homeworld, the Astro System. The Supreme Leader observed the happenings on the planet that the humans had occupied. He was impressed by the human Captain Peters. The man had survived multiple waves of assault against him. While most of his soldiers had perished, Peters remained defiant. The Supreme Leader knew this man was a formidable foe that could threaten the Rukpli Empire. He refused to take any chances with this man. Just when the Supreme Leader thought the humans on the southern section of their city were defeated, Peters managed to muster hundreds of more humans. How was that possible? He had not anticipated the arrival of more humans to defend the human city. He had expected the humans to cower and run away after the mass casualties the Rukpli had inflicted on them. However, that had not happened. The Supreme Leader felt troubled by the human species. They were too persistent in defending the planet. He had encountered many species who had eventually been defeated and subdued. However, the humans didn't seem to be the kind that would give up. There was a sound behind him. The Supreme Leader turned, irritated at being disturbed. It was one of his Rukpli commanders, Joel. What is it? The Supreme Leader demanded. We are ready to send in the next wave of vessels to the human planet, Joel announced. Delay that order, the Supreme Leader interjected, as he turned back and pondered about the humans. Yes, Supreme Leader, Joel bowed. The Supreme Leader stepped aside so that the commander could view the projection. What do you see? A species on the brink of death, Joel sneered. I disagree, the Supreme Leader countered. There was silence. The Supreme Leader enjoyed testing his commanders. They needed to be able to discern beyond the surface. Although Commander Joel was one of his best in the Rukpli Empire, He still had much to learn about other species. I see a persistent species that is going to be a problem for us, the Supreme Leader admitted. When we send in the rest of the Omega fleet, we should be able to wipe everyone off that planet, Joel said. What if we cannot, the Supreme Leader mused. I don't understand, Supreme Leader. Cannot wipe out the humans, the Supreme Leader insisted. For instance, do we know where the rest of them are hiding? Our sensors indicate north of their city, Joel replied, but we do not know the exact location. Precisely, the Supreme Leader scowled. I believe they are using the mineral, our very own life source, effectively against us. How would they be able to do that, Joel asked. The Supreme Leader was able to detect the skepticism in Joel's reply. We should not take this human species for granted. Joel remained puzzled, but the Supreme Leader knew he wouldn't dare ask any further questions. Supreme Leader, what do you propose? Joel asked. Prepare for the extraction process, the Supreme Leader ordered. But we haven't been able to secure the planet, Joel commented. That is why we need to do the extraction now before the humans attack us with something else, the Supreme Leader declared. The Supreme Leader had his suspicions about the humans. However, he did not feel it was a time to share it with Joel and the rest of the commanders. Prepare the extraction, the Supreme Leader ordered. As you wish, Supreme Leader. Joel bowed and left his presence. The Supreme Leader turned back to observe the planet. While he would take delight in wiping out the human species, that wasn't the priority now. He had an empire to strengthen, and the mineral was key to that. Despite that, there was something else about the humans that had changed. At the moment, he wasn't certain what it was, but it would come to him soon. Chapter 38, Trebium Mine Outside of Tomb. Lieutenant Cruz looked in horror at the carnage. She couldn't take it all in. She nearly threw up at the smell of the dead bodies. Lieutenant, a voice shouted. Cruz wiped the tears off her face and turned around. Captain Stanley was waving to her from a distance. He must have landed his shuttle and come to help. She darted over to him. The moment she saw the Rabinto, she stopped. Stanley must have seen her facial expression. This is Korea from the Rabinto species. We are here to help. Cruz nodded, but she didn't know what anyone could do. The majority of the units under her charge had been decimated. She only had a few soldiers left. Korea pointed up. What's that? Cruz turned around and gazed in the direction of the feeble Rabinto's hand. A giant machine-like vessel was hovering over the top of the Trebium mine. It had a large metal extrusion that was plugged into the mine. I didn't see that before, Stanley said. It's here for the mineral, Korea remarked. I think it's mining it out of the planet. There was a crackling sound that pierced the sky like drilling. The female Rabinto was right. The Rukpli were now mining the Trebium. That was the only explanation for the appearance of the machine-like vessel. I'm going to report this to General Williams, Cruz said. She opened the comms with the general. Yes, Lieutenant, Williams said. Cruz shared what they were witnessing over the Trebium mine. Wait a moment, Williams remarked. It was a long few seconds before Williams' voice crackled through the comms. Our sensors spotted 3 more such vessels in various parts outside of Tomb. As you said, these must be mining the Trebium. I don't know how they breached the orbital blockade, but now we have to deal with them. Do what you can to stop them. We'll alert the UFS to send vessels. Yes, sir, Cruz said and ended the comms. What could she do against such a machine-like vessel? I'll head up in the shuttle and try to fire at it, Stanley announced. Wait, Korea said. Look. It was only then that Cruz noticed a group of Rukpli fighter ships. They had positioned themselves around the Rukpli mining vessel. They were defending it, and there was more joining the group. Stanley grimaced. I cannot fight off all those Rukpli fighters. Cruz frowned. There was no way to stop the Rukpli mining vessel from the air. That left them with only one option. Chapter 39, Trebium Mine Outside of Tomb. Stanley followed Cruz into the Trebium mine. When the lieutenant had proposed the idea, he had been wary about heading into the mine. They didn't know who they would encounter inside of it. With most of the soldiers dead and the emitters destroyed, the only protection they had against the Rukpli was the Trebium armor. But Cruz had passed him the serum, which he had injected immediately. He had been surprised to hear of it. It must have been just released to Captain Peters and his units, but it was as yet untested. No one knew if the serum would actually work against the Rukpli body jump. Korea had been all smiles when she had heard of the serum. Cruz gestured to them as Stanley followed her with Korea beside him. As they approached the entrance to the Trebium mine, the stench of the dead had been overwhelming. He had tried to stay above it. As they inched forward into the mine, Stanley trained his weapon in front of him. He had wanted to report to Admiral Sheldon, but there had been no time for it. They needed to disable the mining operation. Once the Rukpli finished mining all the Trebium off Euphra, there would be no need of the planet for them. He could imagine that the Rukpli would then initiate an overwhelming orbital bombardment of Euphra and wipe out every living thing. Cruz stopped them and pointed at the ground. Stanley narrowed his eyes. There were tracks and none of them appeared to belong to humanity. It seemed the Rukpli aliens had also gone into the mine. Stanley nodded and motioned for them to continue. A few minutes later, Cruz stopped again. She exchanged a glance with him. The faint sound of drilling could be heard up ahead. Before Stanley could utter a word, red streaks of weapon fire came at them. He ducked and rolled to the side. He glanced up. Cruz was on the ground while Courier was returning fire. Stanley crawled towards Cruz's body. She was still alive, but her Trebium armor had taken a beating. She had lost most of the protection of the Trebium armor. Stanley knew he had to evacuate her quickly. If not, the Rukpli would do a body jump into her and Cruz would be gone. Stanley turned to Courier. We need to get her away from here. Courier must have understood the implications as she moved forward to help pick up Cruz. However, additional weapons fire emerged from within the mine. It wasn't going to be possible for Courier to carry Cruz. You need to carry her, Courier shouted as she positioned herself between the incoming weapons fire and Cruz's body. Stanley didn't like this plan. Although the Rabinto exoskeleton was thicker and stronger than that of humans, she wasn't invincible. Now, Courier ordered as she fired deeper into the mine. Stanley was frustrated, but he listened to her and began to slowly pick up Cruz. He tried to ignore the exchange of weapons fire between the Rukpli aliens and Courier. He didn't know how long the female Rabinto could last against them, but once he got Cruz away from here, Courier could fall back. Then an explosion ripped through the mine. Courier's body went flying over his head and slumped against the wall. Stanley collapsed onto his knees, dropping Cruz's body back to the ground. Stanley blinked his eyes and stared ahead. 3 Rukpli aliens were approaching them. He looked for his weapon, but realized it wasn't with him. Chapter 40. Trebium Mine Outside of Tomb. Stanley shouted at them defiantly. I have a grenade. I'll blow this whole mine up. He pretended to grab something from his holster. It was a gamble, but without a weapon in his hand, this was as good as it was going to get. Would the Rukpli believe his bluff? He was about to find out. Do you think that can stop us? The first Rukpli sneered. We are many. You are one. Nothing can stop us. Stanley remained silent. The first Rukpli alien motioned with his weapon at Cruz. Your friend has no protection. I will jump into her and she will be gone. Stanley gritted his teeth. The Rukpli had noticed the torn away Trebium armor from Cruz's body. He had no way to stop them if they wanted to body jump into her. Say goodbye to your friend, human. The Rukpli alien scowled. Stanley waited for the inevitable, but nothing happened. He blinked his eyes. The Rukpli alien who had spoken was still standing near Cruz's body. The Rukpli alien glanced at the other 2 Rukpli. Stanley could sense that the Rukpli were communicating with each other. He had heard of this mode of communication from his chief medical officer. However, he had never expected to witness it live in action. The Rukpli weren't speaking, but simply looking at each other. The first Rukpli turned back to Cruz and stared at her. Stanley understood what was going on. Humphrey's serum with the Rabinto DNA had worked. It had somehow prevented the Rukpli body jump and protected Cruz. This was incredible. Stanley wanted to shout for joy but held his tongue. The Rukpli aliens were still armed and could simply kill him if they chose to do so. Then weapons fire roared past him at the Rukpli aliens. Courier was alive. Stanley exhaled a sigh of relief. The female Rabinto was so much stronger than he had ever imagined. He expected the Rukpli aliens to return fire and kill him in the process, but they didn't. Instead, they withdrew into the depths of the mine. Courier rushed to his side. What happened? Stanley grabbed Courier by the shoulders. The serum worked. It worked. Courier didn't withdraw from him but looked at him in confusion. I'm sorry, I was too excited, Stanley said as he stood. The Rukpli alien tried to body jump into Cruz's body. He told me himself, but he couldn't. I saw they couldn't. The serum worked. Let's move Cruz away first, Courier said. Stanley frowned. Why wasn't Courier as excited as him? This was an astonishing breakthrough. It was a game changer. He needed to update Admiral Sheldon as soon as possible. Despite his excitement, he helped Courier lift Cruz and carry her out of the mine. Reaching the mine entrance, they stopped. He helped place Cruz on the ground. Do you hear that? Courier asked. Stanley didn't hear anything at first. Then he heard the rumbling. It was coming from above the Trebium mine. Without waiting, he darted outside and looked up. The Rukpli machine-like mining vessel had retracted itself. It was now a circular-shaped vessel, and it was moving away from the Trebium mine. Escorting it on either side were the Rukpli fighters. Stanley suppressed a sigh. The Rukpli must have extracted all the Trebium from this mine. Chapter 41, Southern Quadrants, Arcadia. Fire, Peter shouted. He had been repeating his orders incessantly during the last several seconds. At first, some of the settlers hadn't done anything. Instead, they had remained stationary. It took Peters a moment to recognize that they didn't know him or his voice. He then began darting across the groups of settlers and ordering them to fire upon the Rukpli aliens. He had been exasperated with the settlers, but he should have known better. The settlers had no training. His uncle had disappeared. He didn't know where the heck he was hiding. Some of the settler groups had managed to bring down their Rukpli targets. However, Peters knew not to get his hopes up. There were so many Rukpli aliens. Another group had just arrived on the surface and were preparing to march towards Arcadia. Then he heard the rumbling sound. He looked about. His uncle was driving several transports towards the marching Rukpli aliens. Inside each of them were a group of settlers. What were they thinking? Peters couldn't recognize the transports and assumed they belonged to the settlers. Peters was about to run towards them, but the transport sped out past him and before he could say or do anything. Peters clenched his jaw. This was a suicide mission. There were 5 transports in total. They roared towards the trench and stopped. Then a few settlers laid some metal over the trenches and the transports began moving again. "Stop!" Peters shouted in vain. "You cannot fight them like this." But his voice was drowned out by the weapons fire beside him. The appearance of the transports took the Rukpli aliens by surprise. A few of them stopped only to be shot down by the settlers. Then 5 of the Rukpli aliens broke into a run. Peters looked in horror as the Rukpli aliens rammed into the 5 transports head-on. Each of the transports flipped into the air and landed on its back. A few of the Rukpli aliens had been tossed away during their collision with the transports. But the rest of the Rukpli aliens then began ripping out the doors of the transports. Peters raced out shouting to the settlers around him, "Follow me." Something in him clicked. Although his uncle had done a stupid thing, that was his uncle out there. He repeatedly fired his weapon. The group of settlers beside him also began unleashing bursts of weapons fire. Their noise forced the remaining Rukpli aliens around the 5 transports to pause and look in their direction. "Keep firing," Peters ordered. The Rukpli aliens began to fire their weapons at them. Streaks of red light screamed past Peters as he dodged their weapons fire. He tried to ignore the sounds of men dying on his left and on his right. His only thought was getting to his uncle, who was still trapped in one of the 5 transports. Fortunately, his uncle's transport had killed the Rukpli alien who had rammed it on impact. Weapons fire erupted from the sky. Peters didn't stop, but kept his eyes on the transport which his uncle had been driving. Why had his uncle chosen to do this? Why? Peters couldn't understand. The Rukpli aliens began to fall back. Peters glanced up into the sky. Those were UFS fighter ships. Then, to Peters' horror, 3 of the 5 transports blew up in flames. Those transports were completely consumed by fire in a matter of seconds. However, his uncle's transport was still intact. Upon reaching the transport, Peters swooped down and grabbed hold of the door. It was jammed. His uncle was inside bleeding. The back of the transport was full of dead bodies. Every one of the settlers with his uncle had died. His uncle was the lone survivor for now. One of the young settlers dropped by his side. "Let me help." The young man tried to pull the door, but to no avail. Peters looked around for anything he could use to pry the jammed door open. There was nothing in this empty terrain. "Stand aside," Peters said. The young man stepped out of his way while Peters fired his weapon at the door. He tried the door, but there was nothing. Then an explosion shook the ground. Peters didn't need to guess the source of that explosion. The 4th transport had blown up. His uncle's transport was the only one left. Time was running out. "Peters," a voice whispered. It was his uncle. Peters leaned in to the door. "Don't talk. We'll get you out. Hang in there." "It's too late for me," his uncle said. "This transport is going to explode. You have to get out of here." "Negative," Peters shouted with tears in his eyes. "I'm not leaving you in there." "You have to," his uncle insisted. "I cannot feel my legs. There's no point in saving me now. I refuse to be a burden to others." "What are you talking about?" Peters demanded as a burning smell invaded his nostrils. "Get out of here," his uncle warned. "Why did you have to do this?" Peters shouted. "We won, right?" His uncle smirked. "I saw the retreating aliens." Peters didn't care about the aliens nor about winning or losing. He had already lost his father. Now his uncle was dying. He couldn't let this happen. Not again. "Sir, look," the young man commented. "The enemy ships are coming around." The sound of approaching fighter ships filled his ears. They weren't UFS vessels. Peters turned back to his uncle. "Go now," his uncle shouted with one last breath, and then his lifeless eyes stared out. Peters wiped away his tears. His uncle was dead. Peters tightened his fist. Anger began to overwhelm him. He kicked the door multiple times. His fury wouldn't let up. "Sir," the young man implored, "we need to leave." Peters stood and began racing away from the transport. A few seconds later, weapons fire erupted behind him and an explosion rocked the surface. Peters didn't have to look back to know that the transport with his uncle was gone. Chapter 42, Bridge, UFS Intrepid. Admiral, did I hear you correctly? Mendes asked in disbelief. I said do not engage the Rukpli mining vessel, Sheldon repeated. Mendes couldn't believe what he was hearing. We can take them down easily. They have our Trebium. The other larger Rukpli vessel they had been exchanging weapons fire with had stopped firing. Mendes assumed the Rukpli vessel had taken a beating. His tactical officer had detected multiple breaches in the Rukpli vessel. That's an order, Commander, Sheldon barked, and the comms went dead. Mendes was fuming. He didn't know how those vessels had been able to sneak past the orbital blockade, but now was his chance to destroy them. The Rukpli had come to take the Trebium. Had that been the original plan? Mendes had a feeling it wasn't the case. Something must have changed in their strategy. After checking in with the other vessels orbiting Euphra, he had discovered that 2 more UFS destroyers had vanished. He could only assume they had been destroyed by the Rukpli. That breach also explained the emergence of the Rukpli mining vessels on Euphra. The sensor officer turned to him. Those Rukpli mining vessels will be in orbit in another minute, sir. Understood, Mendes said. He didn't have anything else to tell the bridge crew. They weren't privy to what Admiral Sheldon had told him. Weapons ready, sir, the tactical officer announced. Stand down, Mendes ordered. Sir, the tactical officer asked. Do you have a hearing problem? Mendes barked. No, sir, the tactical officer muttered. Mendes could imagine the glowering look on the tactical officer's face, but he didn't care. Orders were orders. He wasn't going to break them even if they made no sense. The Rukpli mining vessels are on screen now, the sensor officer reported. Mendes narrowed his eyes on the Rukpli mining vessels. They were of a different configuration from the other Rukpli vessels they had previously encountered. They were all moving in formation. Any signs that they are powering up their weapons? Mendes asked. If the Rukpli mining vessels opened fire, Mendes would attack and destroy the Rukpli vessels. Then no one would have the Trebium. Maybe that would be the best way to end this attack. Negative, the sensor officer replied. They are accelerating. Mendes noticed it. Then the Rukpli mining vessel disappeared from their view screen, and with it he suspected all traces of Trebium on Euphra. Sir, the other Rukpli vessel is also gone, the sensor officer reported. Check the status of Armstrong Station, Mendes ordered. They're reporting in, the comms officer announced. All the Rukpli vessels surrounding the space station have also left. Mendes bit his lip. The Rukpli had left. He hoped they wouldn't return, but nothing was certain out here in the Bonnier system. Chapter 43, Titanic Base Arcadia. Peter stood staring out into the mostly empty base. It was eerie studying the emptiness around him. General Williams stood beside him. It had been 5 days since the Rukpli had vanished from Euphra. Those 5 days had been the hardest of Peter's career. A new cemetery was established around the southern quadrants, a memorial to the sacrifices made by all the young men and women. It was the right thing to do. The Euphra Council had proposed it. The process of burying the dead soldiers and settlers was still ongoing. A majority of the settlers and the remaining soldiers had volunteered to help dig the graves. It would take many more days to clear the horror in that part of Arcadia. Miraculously, most of the citizens had been unharmed in the underground bunkers. However, when the civilians had emerged from their bunkers, they had been in a state of shock. Peters had to admit that the devastation to the southern quadrants had been complete. Peters, we will rebuild, Williams said. Peters nodded. Williams was trying to comfort him, but no words would help. Not now. The brunt of the losses had been to his soldiers. It was a humbling time to know that so many sacrificed their lives. What your uncle did was nothing short of courageous, Williams added. He will always have a special mention on Euphra. Peters struggled to keep his emotions in check. He didn't want General Williams to know the truth about his inner struggles. The reality was that he hadn't been able to sleep in days. Every time he tried to close his eyes, his uncle's last few moments kept replaying in his mind. It was unbearable, but he kept it to himself. No one had asked him about it, and he was glad. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone about it. Yes, sir, Peters said. The settlers that came to your defense have requested to join the military, Williams announced. Is that possible? Yes, we will make it possible, Williams replied. We need to rebuild a new army. I won't lie to you that the losses are significant. But if the settlers can be trained, we can create a new army. And I believe we will need one. Just because the Rukpli are gone, that doesn't mean there are no more threats out there. We need to be ready for the next alien species. Peters frowned. Williams turned to him. Take a week off. But sir, we need to prepare, Peters interjected. Not immediately, Williams interrupted. These past few weeks have been bad for every one of us, and especially you. Losing your father and uncle isn't something that just happens. Take a week off. If you need more time, go for it. We all mourn in different ways. I don't know how it works for you, but find it and take the time to do it. When you're ready, I'll be waiting for you to help build a new army. What if the Rukpli return? In your current state of mind, you won't be able to help me, Williams said curtly. That's an order, Captain. Williams patted Peter's shoulder and then left him alone, staring into the empty base. Chapter 44, Captain's Ready Room UFS Intrepid. Stanley stared out of his viewport. There was a buzz and Mendez stepped in. Commander, what's the status of the vessel? Stanley asked as Mendez took a seat. All departments have reported in, Mendez replied. Everything is operational. The breaches we took from the Rukpli attacks have all been repaired. I suggest we give the crew some shore leave. They need it. That's a good idea, Stanley said. They need to take a break before we encounter another alien species. Captain, you should also get some rest, Mendez suggested. I will. With all the Trebium gone, I don't expect the Rukpli will be back anytime soon, Mendez said. They got what they came for. Stanley nodded. We also discovered that the burial site had been emptied out. They took all their dead Rukpli with them. I don't understand why they stopped fighting us. They were winning. Once they realized they wouldn't be able to body jump into us, I believe their strategy changed. But even for the Rabinto species, it didn't stop the Rukpli from enslaving them. Stanley had thought about that. He also found it strange why the Rukpli withdrew so quickly. However, that mystery was something they would have to live with. How are the Rabinto? Mendez asked. Thankfully, humanity always has a way of opening its arms for those in need, Stanley replied. The Rabinto have been given a city of their own. It was abandoned, but now we will help them restore it. Mendez seemed pleased with that. Hopefully it will be a new start for them. Stanley agreed. Yes, I think we have all learned that we need to live amongst other species. It was a hard pill to swallow for many during the Rukpli attack, but people will come around to that reality. They already are, ever since they heard of the success behind the serum. The Rabinto also can become a good ally to have in case the Rukpli or whatever else reappears. He had heard that the civilians had stopped grumbling about aliens after discovering the extent of the casualties. Humanity had been too naive to think they could just relocate to a new planet and start afresh. Although 50 years had been evidence of peace, it was but an illusion, a season of undisturbed colonization which had now ended in a flurry of death. Humanity would need to learn to live amongst others and be ready for them. Isolation was no longer an option. The end.